Chapter 249. The so-called loyalty was just a disguise to gain an advantage against a common enemy. The so-called allies, in most cases, were just to avoid being attacked from the front and the back. Key saw the loyal allies very clearly, so he didn't take it seriously. Accompanied by the big-bellied general, the young blue dragon strolled on the streets of Bite City at a speed that was neither too fast nor too slow. He walked towards the residence, specially built for the Pasha who came to visit Pharaoh. On the day of Opat festival, according to tradition, Pharaoh, accompanied by the Grand Vader and other ministers, would go around the streets of Bite City to receive the blessings of thousands of citizens of the city. Bite City was known as the City of 10,000 Cities. Although it wasn't as big as 10,000 cities, it was still as big as dozens of gnome cities. Therefore, the monarch of Medic, who relied on his feet to measure the land of the city, was too busy today. Most of the other Pasha who came to report would arrive tonight or even tomorrow. Although Quest wasn't the only one to arrive on a floating behemoth so early in the morning, it was still extremely rare. However, this was also what the young blue dragon wanted. He had heard of Bite City long ago, but he never had the chance to see it. Even when Gnome hired a construction team to build a terminal on the outskirts of Bite City, a building for parking the Leviathan derivatives, he was too busy to come in person because he was busy conquering the island world. Since he had nothing to do, Keys made up his mind to visit the city and experience the fun of walking through the streets. Stepping on the road paved with mortar and gravel, listening to the squeak sound of the wide-tailed carriage's wheels rolling on the road, the young blue dragon sighed with emotion. The source of a city's greatness was the manager, and the external manifestation of its greatness was the people who lived here. The managers of Bite City, under the leadership of Pharaoh and the Grand Vader, had formulated good rules for the city. The wide roads, although intricate, were orderly. They connected every corner of the city. Even new buildings like the terminal were included in this extremely orderly road network. With convenient transportation, trade and commerce were naturally flourishing. As for the residents of Bite City, those who lived in the capital of Cheese City of the United States, they had long been accustomed to obeying the good orders set by the managers. They had developed the self-awareness to maintain such norms. Compared to Nome, Spat, and even any city under Keys' jurisdiction, the roads in those cities were not as clean and tidy as in Bite City. As the Megalosaurus Pasha walked on the streets, he even saw many subhumans spontaneously picking up trash and cleaning up the streets. As expected of the capital of the United States of America, Keys said earnestly to the big-bellied general who was leading the way, "This is indeed a paradise full of the power of order." Just when the big-bellied general was about to say something to please the Megalosaurus Pasha, a sound of horns, drums, and cymbals came from the main road of Bite City, not far away, reminding the many citizens waiting on the streets that Pharaoh's parade was coming from afar and would pass by here soon. Frowning, the young blue dragon seemed to be a little unhappy that his mood was disturbed. He ordered the people who followed him, "Take this path to the bazaar in Bite City. I want to see how the business is doing here." Before he could finish his sentence, the two brothers, Crooked Mouth and One-Eyed, who had come with Quest and were now serving under him, flashed into an alley on the side of the street without waiting for Medica's general to order his personal soldiers. These two seasoned guys were one step ahead. They wanted to clean up the obstacles on the way for His Excellency Pasha. Having lived in Bite City for a period of time, they knew that in this beautiful and orderly place, there would also be some disharmonious noises. If there were some ignorant people, such as ladies on the streets or bosses in the alleys, they were afraid that would affect His Excellency Pasha's mood again. "Actually, it's not necessary." Walking behind Keys, the big-bellied general muttered in a low voice while holding the hilt of his scythe at his waist, "With these good guys by my side, all the bad guys will have to retreat." In the alley they just passed by, there was a dustbin on the side of the road. An arm stretched out from the open lid. From the strange tattoos on the arm, it could be concluded that the person who was knocked unconscious inside was most likely a young talent who was in charge of the street. After walking for a short while and turning left and right a few times in the streets, they came to the entrance of the largest bazaar in Bite City. This bazaar or supermarket was located on the northeast side of Bite City, adjacent to the sea wall of the city. In the north of Bite City, in addition to the military port of Medic, there was a deep-water seaport dedicated to commercial purposes, not far below the seawall. In order to facilitate the transportation of goods by merchants, this section of the sea wall was not connected. Instead, two towers were used as portals, forming a huge city gate that was open all day long. If a war broke out, the spells attached to the towers would take effect immediately. Earth walls would rise, and with the addition of mud to stone, the loopholes in the sea wall would be repaired. Therefore, Pharaoh of Medic had no worries about this. He only sent a few soldiers and a black-robed mage with an apprentice to guard the tower on the edge of the seawall. On the other hand, the number of tax officials was rather shocking. In order to arrange for the officials to be on duty all day long and collect business tax, the pharaoh had specially built a single-story office for them inside the seawall. He had even equipped them with specialized guards. In fact, it was understandable. After all, this was the largest commercial port of Medic, and the throughput of merchant ships from all over the country was amazing. Looking out from the gap in the seawall, Keyes could see the densely packed merchant ships docked at the port. Although he had established the scale of perpetual order that connected all the major cities of Medic with the derivative of the Leviathan as an air transport vehicle, the young Blue Dragon still could not underestimate the ships that carried at least 2,000 barrels per ship, the sea trade they represented, and the commercial giants in charge of this trade. Your Excellency Pasha, the illusionist brothers who had arrived at the bazaar earlier had completed the preliminary investigation. One Eye handed over a papyrus full of words. This is the purchasing and sales guide of the day, compiled and printed by the managers of the bazaar and the specialized personnel of the tax officers. It recorded yesterday's sales of goods and made some recommendations for the merchants' activities today. Crooked Mouth, who was next to One Eye, added to his brother's report. This piece of paper is worth 1 silver cate, plus 15 copper debentures, and the daily printing is limited to 600 copies. Usually, it would have been sold out by this time. But today is OPAD day, so we printed twice the number. That's why we could buy such a piece of paper. Keyes nodded, expressing his recognition of the two's work attitude and ability. He took the high-priced purchasing and sales guide and read the content on it. He felt that it was indeed worth the money. In terms of classification, the purchasing and sales guide was very detailed. The hot-selling goods listed in the guide almost included goods from Medic and even all over the Ashes world. For example, the Fanatic armor produced in Gnome City, the wine brewed in Sparut City, and the Pink Lake salt produced by Taka were all listed. Different from the investigation done by ordinary merchants, the tax department of Bite City had participated in the compilation of the purchasing and sales guide. No one knew better than them the specific number of goods unloaded from the port every day. In addition, the manager of the Grand Bazaar submitted a list of the sales volume of various goods every day. They could make a very reasonable judgment about the price adjustment of goods. For both the seller and the buyer, these records were undoubtedly very important information. They hid secrets that could increase wealth and reduce risk. Checking the last line one by one, Keyes was a little surprised by a message on the purchasing and sales guide. Recently, fossils and amber specimens have become hot commodities, the young Blue Dragon asked, but the reaction of the people around him was similar. Obviously, they did not know the whole story. They were even shipped from all over the Ashes world. Because someone in Bite City bought them all together, the price of those things has, increased by 20%? When a superior asked, the subordinate had to agree. In order to answer the question of Megalosaurus Pasha, General Big Belly directly sent his guards to find the manager of the Grand Bazaar and bring him back. By the eternal blaze, good day to you, my lords. As soon as the manager of the Grand Bazaar saw Keyes and the others, he bowed and greeted them. The manager of the Grand Bazaar was an official of the Medici Empire, but in fact he had never received even a copper debenture from Pharaoh. He just relied on this power to make a living for himself. His income consisted of two sources. One was the management fee collected from various businesses in the Grand Bazaar, but this money was mostly used to hire cleaning staff and mercenaries to maintain order. It rarely fell into his wallet. The other part of his income, or the money that he really used to support his family, was the income from the purchasing and sales guide jointly with the tax department. After deducting the share with the tax department and other costs, he could earn about 200 to 300 silver cats a day. This was definitely a profitable business, and he could be regarded as a successful businessman. And as a businessman, it was simply instinctive for him to size up the situation. Hearing the question of the Megalosaurus Pasha in front of him, he did not hesitate and hurriedly replied, "There is indeed a big shot buying fossils in amber. His Excellency the Great Wecht has recently built a bite museum, so he's been collecting biological fossils in amber from all over the world this month." Chapter 250. This is not how you should treat a guest. A shriveled hand reached out from the crimson robe and gently fiddled with the silver cutlery on the table below with its fingernails. "I thought that through our cooperation, you and I would have established a closer bond." In the face of the demon count's questioning, the Grand Vexer was calm. "Didn't I pay the bill?" He used his chin to point at the linen bag on the table. "Friendship can never be bought with the soul prism." Kanini, the demon count, just smiled a little and immediately controlled his expression. Friendship is friendship, business is business. Out of fear of the powerful mortal spellcaster in front of him, he said, "Of course, you have special treatment in terms of discounts. Leave at once." The Grand Vexer ordered him to leave. Before his voice died away, the air in the whole room was filled with fine silver dust, and a light purple rainbow flashed in his eyes. "Or stay here forever." A thick smoke with a sulphurous smell rose. Kanini did not say anything else and directly activated the advanced teleportation spell and left. The demon count was very clear and appreciated the wisdom and rationality of the Grand Vexer. He did not want to and could not make any written or oral contract with him, because the previous generations of Alan were equivalent to the reincarnation of Shurik. Their real souls were actually still confined to the North Tower. Or rather, their souls were protected by the soul-binding tower, and even a powerful demon count like him could not do anything about it. But what did that matter? As long as he still needed the special resources of the 9 prisons of Bader, as long as he still had a deeper hostility toward the demon order that appeared in the Ashen world, then he had to make use of each other and seek common ground while reserving differences with the demon count. After sorting out his thoughts, the powerful demon, known for his prudence, once again showed a harmless smile on his face. In fact, he did not want to waste any more time in the Grand Vexer's museum. He had other meetings to arrange today, and the Grand Vexer's order to leave was in his favor. But there is no need to tell him this, Kanini thought to himself. No matter how powerful he is just a mortal. The person he was going to visit next was not a mortal. And from a certain point of view, the other party was on the same side as him. It's just that their standpoints are different, and their relationship isn't harmonious. At night, Bite City was still boisterous, but not as noisy as it was during the daytime. Some of the older citizens, or those who were too young, returned to their homes, leaving only the young people who loved the carnival atmosphere of Opat Festival reluctantly on the streets. "First, I have to find my own position," Kanini thought calmly as he walked through the dark alleys. Using the analytical skills he learned from the famous Bartow Academy, he tried to find his own advantages. "Then, I have to cater to their liking," the owl let out a satisfied cry. It had just gotten lucky and caught a large rat in the city who had eaten a lot during the Opat Festival. However, it did not expect that when it was complacent, its cry would affect others. After a few light popping sounds, the unlucky bird, along with the large rat in its claws, turned into ashes that filled the sky. "I can't be complacent anymore." The demon count reminded himself of the misfortune of other creatures as he harvested the lives of mortals with just a glance. "Otherwise, I'll be reduced to ashes." Kanini's tone, which was close to an aria, made him seem a little too emotional. This was, of course, his disguise. It was also used to ease the lingering anxiety brought about by the extremely rational thinking unique to the Batsu race. He was a demon count, and a unique demon, but in the 9 prisons of Bader, he was in a rather awkward position. Just like when he graduated from the academy, he wrote, on the importance of class. Class to the Batsu is like food, air, and water to mortals. Just like how rotten food, poisonous air, and unclean water can harm the health of mortals, the wrong class can also bring all kinds of risks to demons. Since his parents were both unique demons, Kanini was also born as a unique demon. This could be considered a special honor in Bador. Compared to those of his kind who had been promoted from inferior demons, his birth was undoubtedly much more noble. The so-called unique demon meant a demon with a unique form and uniqueness. Most of them evolved from pit fiends who wanted to advance further and used their strength to serve the various lords of the nine hells. Because of their abilities and strength, they were given the title of Devil Duke by the lords. Kanini's birth was due to the deep alliance between the two Devil Dukes. As a second-generation, unique demon, although he inherited some of his parents' strengths, he still couldn't compare to them in terms of strength. Thus, a second-generation demon, like Kanini, could only become a devil count at most. In terms of class, they had a natural ceiling unless one of their parents died. However, the probability of this happening was almost zero. Apart from their awkward position, every demon count would face endless danger from the moment they were born. Not only would the Devil Duke, but their parents would also be filled with dread, and they would be unable to advance. They would also have to endure all kinds of schemes from their subordinates, even probing them with force. Most of the subordinates of these demon counts were ambitious and powerful pit fiends. They were constantly under threat from them, and no one could be confident that they wouldn't be overthrown. Anxiety was the norm for every demon count. In order to alleviate this anxiety, they would often indulge in all kinds of material pleasures, living a life of drunken stupor every day to numb their tense nerves. However, unlike the typical second generation, Kanini had shown his foresight from a young age. Not only had he taken the risk to complete all his studies in that terrifying academy on the 9th level of Bator, he'd even obtained first place in his year. Knowledge was power, but more importantly, knowledge was often the key to solving difficult problems. In the vast and dangerous library of the academy, Kanini had chanced upon a piece of information hidden in the spine of a certain book. Tens of thousands of years ago, in order to regulate the gift of Bator, the Lord of the Nine Hells had issued a bounty regulation. This regulation, written by the Astamors himself, clearly divided the different rewards that could be obtained for various acts of loyalty to the 9 prisons of Bator. One of them had left Kanini pleasantly surprised. It is hereby announced that all living beings in the multiverse who can drag an entire plane into Bator in the spirit of encouragement, it is possible to make it a subsidiary of Bator, but the reward will be reduced by 1 level. Non-Batsu races will receive rewards including, but not limited to becoming a greater demon, obtaining the opportunity to reforge Bator, being bestowed with legends, or even divine artifacts. The final explanation lies with the 9th level of Bator's Nessus Specialized Council. If a Batsu devil completes this mission, although it is only right, in the spirit of encouragement, an exception will be made for the reward, and the title of Count of the Palace of Nessus will be conferred upon him. In the system of loyalty of the 9 prisons of Bator, becoming a Count of the Palace of Nessus would naturally deviate from the original path of promotion. In other words, if Kanini could complete this mission, he would be free from his parents' shackles. After repeatedly, carefully, and even staring at every single word, Kanini finally confirmed the validity of this bounty regulation. As for its authenticity, any mention of the Astamors in the 9 prisons of Bator, whether spoken, written, or even in memories, would be known by that lord. The very fact that the bounty regulation existed in the spine of the book was proof that it was authentic. However, the cautious Kanini still made a final confirmation. He spent nearly a third of his wealth on the sole prism to obtain the chance to legally check the announcements of the Nessus Plane Administration. After spending half a day, he found the initial information about the bounty regulation that was released 30,000 years ago, as well as the announcement of the first batch of counts of the Palace of Nessus that was made due to the bounty regulation 2,000 years ago. After repeatedly flipping through the announcements stored in the spell screen, and confirming that there was no other information about the bounty regulation being added or suspended, Kanini was so excited that he almost burst into tears. After wasting nearly 20,000 years, Kanini, the second generation of demons, finally found a suitable path of promotion for himself. Thus, after smoothly graduating from the academy, he encountered a series of failures, one after the other. First, his inflexible use of tactics in a bloody battle led to the complete annihilation of his army, and he was looked down upon by the Devil Duke, whom he was loyal to. Then, because he was greedy for good food, he was discovered to have smuggled some kind of bateau liquor and was punished by having half of his wealth confiscated. Finally, a pit fiend under him reported him for embezzling the soul prism that should have been paid to the Devil Duke. He was demoted, and his whipped body was exiled to some remote plane in the middle of nowhere. This pride of bateau gradually became an example of how some Batsa devil parents who believed that studying was useless would educate their children. Kanini's heart grew more and more excited. After all, when he was studying in the academy, he had obtained full marks in his strategic games course. Using tactical failures to cover up strategic successes had already become an instinct of this devil, ingrained in his very bones. In order to reduce the amount of attention he received, when he first arrived in the Ashes Plain, Kanini once again directed and acted out a good play. He established an outpost of bateau in the Ashes Plain and then reverted to his old ways. Using force that went against the aesthetic standards of most high-ranking devils, he attempted to forcibly conquer the plain. In the end, it naturally ended in failure, and he had no choice but to go into hibernation. Of course, there was some truth to this play. Due to being demoted, he was forced to descend to this plane with his true body. If he was killed, he would truly die. When he faced the previous Grand Vexual, he had indeed suffered heavy injuries. He could only disguise himself as an ordinary mortal and blend into the aristocratic system of medic, slowly recuperating. Only recently did this devil count gradually recover, and he created the Obsidian Council. However, he did not expect to encounter unexpected resistance, and was repeatedly rubbed against the ground by a young blue dragon who was unbelievably valiant. Sigh. Kanini took a deep breath and walked to the door of an apartment. Everything is for the sake of living. Chapter 251. I brought sincerity. Kanini pushed a bag of soul prisms in front of Keys. Genuine sincerity. Not long ago, this was a reward exchanged from the Grand Vexil with some materials from the Hell of Bader. Not long after, it became a sincerity for the Demon Count to invite the young blue dragon to form an alliance with him. Keys seemed unmoved by the wealth at his fingertips. Instead, he asked playfully, sincerity? Soul prisms are just a currency. Besides, even if it's sincerity, Megalosaurus Pasha sat in front of the table, tilted his chin, and pointed at the bag on the table. With your status as the president of the Obsidian Council, or as a Batsu of the 9 prisons of Bader, this is definitely not enough sincerity. Greedy reptile. Kanini cursed in his heart, but his expression remained kind and polite. He did not refute. Instead, he opened his personal spatial equipment and took out a machine from it. Don't worry, there are no blades on it. Kanini looked at Keys, who was sitting opposite him with his back arched, ready to strike at any time. He found a bit of psychological balance, and his explanation became more patient. This is a casting tool for the soul prisms. Any Batsu with a bit of wealth must have it at home. However, this is the real thing I bought from Ness's department store. In terms of performance, it can shake off the high-quality imitations made by the merchants of Ugros by the entire Great Avernus Plains. Of course, the difference in price between the two was even greater than the difference in performance. The Demon Count cursed in his heart. He looked at the young blue dragon, who was very interested in the machine, and began to twist some of the parts on it. This made Kanini's heart ache, but he still maintained a good demeanor. The Soul Prisms casting tool sold by Ness's department store, in addition to the usual casting function, also has the function of inspecting the soul prisms. Taking back the casting tool from the Megalosaurus Pasha's hands without a trace, Kanini deliberately ignored the broken handle made of Bartholomew. He extracted a soul prism from the sincerity he brought and placed it into a groove on the casting tool. A weak flame sprang up, and the crystal shell of the soul prism was instantly incinerated. The soul trapped within emerged. "You're quite lucky." Kanini glanced at Keys. "The soul is relatively complete, so it can be manifested more clearly." The young blue dragon immediately understood what he meant. As soon as the devil count finished speaking, one of the carvings on the casting tool came to life. A miniature pit fiend walked out, spreading its wings and letting out a soundless roar before soaring into the air and grabbing that miserable soul. The funny-looking pit fiend rubbed and opened its hands, and the soul of the mortal turned into a palm-sized light screen, showing some of the scenes it had experienced before its death. Because it was relatively complete, the scenes were indeed clearer. Kanini stretched out his finger and swiped it in the air, and the scene on the light screen suddenly sped up, directly jumping to the moment when the soul left the body and the body died. At that time, the soul seemed to be guided by something, and it stubbornly passed through the heavy obstacles of the mortal world, straight into a dark tower shrouded in smoke. The soul-bound tower, the North Tower. Keys immediately recognized the extremely recognizable tower. The scene that appeared after that left the young blue dragon somewhat incredulous. After stopping in the North Tower for who knows how long, a man in a purple mage robe walked in and grabbed the soul into his hands. The scene changed, and the soul was thrown into the casting tool of the soul prism, and was immediately made into a soul prism. Embezzlement. Kanini expressed his understanding of the Grand Vader's actions. The Ashen world accepted soul-binding sorcerers because they took on a part of Death's work. The Devil Count did not know that Keys had actually reached an agreement with Shurik, the master of the North Tower. He knew some inside information about the soul-bound tower, and also knew the attitude of soul-binding sorcerers towards the demons of the lower realms who were keen on collecting souls. But it was precisely because of this that Keys felt somewhat puzzled. What was the reason for the Grand Vader to make a deal with the devil? If he wanted to obtain something from the devil, why didn't he just directly kill the devil and plunder it? He had to admit that the devil in front of him was very powerful. After devouring the power of the camel serpent, which wielded part of the authority of war, the young blue dragon could benefit from his ability to actively adapt. In his eyes, Kanini's strength was even greater than his when he had just returned from the Blood War. But even so, Kanini should not be a match for the Grand Vader. In fact, it was precisely because he was afraid of this human spellcaster that Keys had reached a reconciliation agreement with him, or rather, with Shurik's reincarnation. And this time, he dared to come to Bite City alone to complain to Pharaoh because he had gained something in the island world. Otherwise, with Keys' cautious nature, he would never have arranged this trip. What I actually want to say is, seeing that Keys was deep in thought, Kanini immediately sensed something. He did not want this possible ally to think too much and have many misgivings, so he stopped his lengthy narration and summarized his thoughts in concise words. "Your Excellency and I can join hands and share a large part of this wealth. Unlike the current me, who can only earn some pitiful and undignified money." He used an impeccable motive, the devil's greed for souls, to conceal his true purpose, to fight against the Grand Vader and wipe out the obstacles that dragged the Ashen world into Batower. Unless it was a student of Batsu who had experienced the baptism of that terrifying academy like him, most people would not be able to detect the trickery in this. In order to make his reasoning more convincing, Kanini released an important piece of news. "We have to hurry. Traces of those scum from the bottomless abyss have appeared in this world. You must have some memories of the ambush you encountered in Spat City, as well as the Rakshasa that was killed by the Tiefling traders." Kanini threw out the demon threat theory and explained in a self-evident way why the Obsidian Council was so against the Megalosaurus Pasha. This undoubtedly added some authenticity to Kanini's words. So Keys did not believe what he said at all. However, the young blue dragon did not show any objection. Instead, he took the sincerity that was placed on the table and the machine that forged the sincerity into his arms. I've sensed the signs of sincerity. I just need to think about it for now. With that, Keyes gestured for his guest to leave. He did not say that he wanted to ask for the valuable soul prism forge back. Kanini maintained a kind smile and walked out of the apartment where the Megalosaurus Pasha stayed. Keyes said, "More sincerity might shorten the time I need to think. It's worth a try." Kanini was speechless. Chapter 252. In a Board's Dream, the desert elf mercenary captain who was on the verge of collapse desperately wanted to move forward. He noticed the towering mountains and deep ravines around him, but they looked so unfamiliar. Taking a step forward, a Board wanted to figure out where he was. As he moved forward, an extremely uncomfortable creaking sound could be heard. A Board lowered his head and found that he was already wrapped in metal armor. No matter where he looked, he could only see brownish-red metal plate armor. And from time to time, a disgusting worm would poke out from the cracks of the plate armor. Whoosh! Taking a deep breath, the desert elf suddenly woke up from his sleep. Experiencing such nightmares had become a normal part of his life, but the scenes in his dreams would occasionally be different. Other than the horror brought by the worm armor, the nightmare that a Board experienced the most was actually the one that happened near the holy land of Washigu. It was accompanied by the smell of ton incense and the whistling of the machete. That time, he almost could not wake up again. Perhaps it was the prayer that he prayed to everything before his death that the next day, the decapitated Board was dragged out of the sand pit where his body was buried. Weak mortals, the desert elf mercenary captain still remembered the first sentence he heard after he regained consciousness. Although he thought that he was brave and determined, he still could not help but cry at that time. "My Lord will bless you." This was the second sentence that the extremely beautiful but vicious seamstress said. "Others took away your weapon, and my Lord will give you a set of armor. You must know how to cherish the opportunity." Since then, a Board wore the worm armor that would often wake him up in his sleep. At first, he wanted to take off the armor out of fear. But later, he found that this armor, like the elven golden sword, could provide a powerful arm for the wielder. And compared to the golden sword, the armor could provide a stronger arm. This was the truth. How could the strange objects created by mortals be compared to the creation of the demon lord? It was no exaggeration to say that after wearing the worm armor and eliminating the interference of the sound spell, if he encountered the desert elf Brock, who had killed him once again, a Board could fight head-on without being at a disadvantage. What a pity. Every time he woke up from his sleep, a Board would fantasize for a while about becoming the master of the desert elves and killing his enemies. But in the end, it would always turn into a helpless sigh. And the task that my Lord gave me must be completed as soon as possible. A Board put his feet down from the hammock and walked out of the cabin that swayed slightly with the waves. A Board climbed up to the top deck. His shoes were a little tight, but this allowed his feet to feel the ground, which was good for maintaining his balance. Compared to the desert elves, the crew's attire. Very few crew members would wear shoes on the sea, and even when they were sailing, some of them did not even be wearing the slightest bit's clothes. A crew member on duty, carrying an empty bottle of wine, slid down from the crow's nest, where the lookout was at the top of the mast. His bare feet brushed against the mast as he slipped down in a few steps. He greeted another crew member who was taking over his shift at the bottom of the mast, and was about to go into the cabin to find a place to take a nap. "Are we almost at the port of Bight?" A Board stopped the lookout, who had just finished his shift. He took out a wine bag from his robe and handed it over. "My men and I are a little anxious from waiting here from Wusong." "Hey, what are you talking about?" The crew member opened his mouth and made an exaggerated expression, but he still took the wine from the desert elf. After all, this was the captain's big customer, and the other party subordinates were all difficult to deal with. He did need to maintain some necessary respect. If it weren't for the Xyloke wind blowing from the south these 2 days, the jackdaw would have arrived at the port Bight. But you don't have to worry. We should be able to arrive by noon today at the latest. The Xyloke wind has stopped, and we have good wind now. After thanking the crew member for his patient explanation, a Board whispered, "Good wind." In the language of the desert elves, good wind equated to smooth sailing. "I hope everything goes well." Aboard walked to the bow of the ship and stared at the sparkling sea as the sun rose in the sky. He wished himself well. It's just a batch of fossils from Wusong. They're only here to sell them for profit. Ha! Laughing dryly, the desert elf seemed to feel that something was wrong. He tightened the scarf around his neck. He did not want to reveal the terrible wound around his neck that seemed to have been stitched up by a shoddy tailor. Mr. President, I don't understand. Lilith leaned forward and placed his hands on the table. If someone looked closely, they would notice that there were a lot of skin near his palms. Why do we have to ally with that guy? There's no reason. At a high price, the black-robed mage, who was hit by the steampunk half-lich's physical hypnosis spell, was turned into a semi-finished mummy in order to prevent him from escaping. Only then was he able to escape the custody of the Megalosaurus Pasha. Since then, Lilith had become the laughingstock of the Obsidian Council. Not only that, the after-effects of being made into a semi-finished mummy, the intermittent drying and shedding of his skin, still continued to torment his body and mind. Even if he repeatedly used spells such as Repair Damage and Remove Curse to heal himself, Lilith's attainment could not be compared to the legendary half-lich who had personally made him. Feeling the skin shedding off his skin, the black-robed mage, who was born as a nobleman and medic, was extremely ashamed. He never thought that His Excellency the President would convene a council in the middle of the night to discuss how to form an alliance with the Megalosaurus Pasha. I strongly disagree. Lilith looked around, hoping that his gaze could find a supporter, but he received very little feedback. In fact, through reading the classics, I have found many spells to counter the Megalosaurus. As long as you can do it alone. Kanini, who was sitting at the top of the long table, lost his patience and bluntly interrupted Lilith. I know you want revenge. You want to use the Megalosaurus Pasha's knowledge of the secrets of the floating behemoths, the monopoly of the air transportation industry, the manufacturing process of the fanatic armor, and other tempting benefits to seek an alliance. Glancing at the counselors present, the demon count saw a tacit understanding in their eyes. But it's also an alliance. Why can't the council directly form an alliance with the Megalosaurus Pasha? With this alliance, everyone is equally likely to share those tempting benefits. You are doing this for yourself. Lilith's sallow face began to turn a little green after being rebuked again. Kanini, however, ignored it. He stood up and walked around the long table of the council. The purpose of the Obsidian Council's existence is to defend the common interests of all noblemen and mages, and not for the personal benefit of one person. Please bear this in mind. When it came to scheming and manipulating people's hearts, even if Lilith lived for another 10,000 years, it was estimated that it would be difficult for him to reach Kanini's level, who graduated first in the most famous academy in Bador. In fact, if he dared to sabotage his plan, Kanini would not let him live past tonight. As wise as you are, we will obey. Lilith bowed and returned to his seat after he finished speaking. Like an old monk in meditation, the black-robed mage did not say a word in the following meeting. Chapter 253. Sleep with a fox and wake up with a stinky body. Sleep with a wild dog and wake up counting fleas. Lilith said resentfully in his heart. The meeting lasted for a long time, from midnight to the morning. Walking out of the manor, Lilith quickly got into his carriage and left. Standing on the balcony, watching the members of the council leaving one after another, Demon Count Kanini, the president of the Obsidian Council, knew that he had pushed them too hard. But time was indeed a precious resource, and he shouldn't waste it. Go to Keniwo Street. Sitting in the carriage, Lilith ordered his coachman. There are not many people on the street since the drunken revelers from yesterday haven't sobered up yet. I have to have some fun. The coachman, who was riding 2 six-legged horses, immediately understood. He turned the carriage around and drove to the southwest of Bite City. The horse's hooves hit the bluestone paved ground, making clattering sounds. The black-robed mage closed his eyes as if he was taking a nap. The layout of Bite City was distributed in layers, mainly divided into 4 major regions: northeast, northwest, southeast, and southwest. The northeast region was close to the trade port. It was an important logistics distribution center and trade center for the whole of Bite and even Medic. The Northwest region had a military port and many military facilities. Nearly 50,000 soldiers, including the Pharaoh Praetorian Legion, were stationed here. The Southeast region was the area of the nobles. In addition to the nobles of Bite, many other nobles of Medic also had properties here. The streets of the Southwest region were relatively narrow, but there were many houses. Except for rich businessmen who could buy houses in the Southeast region, most of the citizens of Bite City lived here. Keniwo Street was located at the border of the Southwest region of Bite City, adjacent to the city's magnificent land wall. The street gathered all the restaurants of Medic, and many taverns were operating here. On Opat Festival, Keniwo Street was very lively. Many foreign circuses, acrobatic troupes, fortune tellers, and illusionist mages would choose to perform here after paying the entrance tax to earn rewards. Perhaps because of the festival and the alcohol, the citizens of Bite City would become very generous at this time of the year. In addition to copper debentures, some people would even take out silver cats to reward the performers they admired. The outsiders had set up tents in the streets, and many young Bite people wandered among them. Even some noble children who rarely appeared in the Southwest District in the past would come here to relax and have fun during Opat Festival. In addition to watching the performances, if one was handsome or had a heavy purse, it was possible to be invited to a tent by a pretty female performer. Well, of course, it was to discuss some private matters. Lilith arrived at Keniwo Street in a carriage. Because the street was narrow and many tents blocked the road, he had to get off early and let the coachman wait on the adjacent street. The arrival of the black-robed mage did not wake up the people who were still hungover or suffering from headaches. Although the sun was high in the sky, heavy and deep snoring could still be heard from the many tents set up on the streets. The sweet smell of alcohol mixed with the faintly discernible smell of vomit mixed together and attacked Lilith's nasal cavity, forcing him to cover his mouth and nose with a handkerchief. The black-robed mage carefully avoided some of the drunkards that were lying on the ground. He slowly walked into the open-air camp that was made up of all kinds of tents. He only stopped when he reached a tent that looked like it belonged to a divination witch. What kind of tent was this? Every time Lilith saw it, the thought of burning it to the ground would arise in his mind. Any craftsman who made a tent would have nightmares at night when they saw the residence of a divination witch. This tent looked like it was made up of more than 24 pieces of cloth of different colors that were haphazardly sewn together. For a mage like Lilith, who could see through the surface and see the essence, he would discover that the different colors formed different patterns, and each pattern contained the power of magic. Even more than that, although he did not quite understand, every time the black-robed mage saw this tent, he would always feel a little confused. A rational spellcaster would never rashly enter such a tent that was similar to a wizard tower. Unfortunately, his hatred for his enemy was so deep that it had blinded his mind. After casting many protective spells on himself in an inconspicuous movement, Lilith lifted the curtain and stepped in. Although the sun caressed every inch of Keniwo Street, the tent was still densely covered in darkness. If it weren't for the ugly oil lamp hanging down from the ceiling, the black-robed mage probably wouldn't have been able to see anything more than 1 foot away from him. But precisely because of this, he didn't need to bother trying to identify the items in the tent. All sorts of bags, flasks, and other unknown objects were hanging everywhere. There were also dried specimens of creatures that were casually piled up in the corners of the tent. Some of them were likely related to humans. You should learn how to knock on the door first. A lazy voice came from the bed in the depths of the tent. The tiefling woman lifted her blanket and stood on the ground to stretch her body. This way, I won't have to change my blanket. She then waved at the bed as if she was saying goodbye to someone. A dark green flame instantly ignited the young man who had enjoyed her bed with the tiefling woman last night. The young man didn't even have time to scream before he was turned into something similar to the dried specimens by the wall. The spellcaster lifted the young man off the bed with one hand. "Aren't you a tailor?" Lilith ignored the tiefling's complaints and teased. "Don't you know how to sew a bell for your own tent?" Aren't you a pot maker? Why don't you carry a pot with you, or carry a tin box with copper tools? The tiefling woman retorted. Isn't that just a nickname that you casually gave me? Lilith appeared to be quite irritable, but that was all. Although he was quite dissatisfied with the nickname of pot maker, this didn't stop him from cooperating with her. Actually, after Lilith learned that the tiefling woman was loyal to a powerful demon lord from the Chaos Abyss, and that the tiefling woman had assisted him in escaping from the Megalosaurus Pasha, Lilith came up with the idea of using the tiefling woman to take revenge for him. And that demon lord seemed to be quite interested in the black-robed mage's suggestion. The evil demon hidden in the Chaos Abyss had not only given Lilith the same nickname as the tailor, but had also given him the dragon-slaying magic that was highly effective against the Megalosaurus. Of course, Lilith had been quite careful in his dealings with the demons. He had rationally refused the overly warm-hearted demon lord's wish to reward him with the power of the demons. The black-robed mage had only signed a magic contract that required him to sacrifice keys in exchange for dragon-slaying knowledge, as well as the support of the demon sect that the tailor had developed in the Ashen World. And this time, he had come to Kiniwo Street precisely for a plan that he had been preparing for a long time, and he needed to have a final discussion with the tailor. After a short stalemate with insults as a form of probing, the conversation went on the right track. That old bastard. Lilith angrily used vulgar words to describe Kanini, but because he feared the power of the Obsidian Council's president, he didn't mention his name. He doesn't want to be enemies with that reptile, and he's even humbly preparing for an alliance. When it came to serious matters, the tailor, or rather, the tiefling spy, became much more cautious. We have to change our plans in time, she said resolutely. In order to complete the mission, we have to pay a little more. Unless the Obsidian Council goes all out, the black-robed mage began to habitually hold an obsidian magic orb in his hand as he fell into deep thought. In the Medici Empire, I'm afraid that only the Grand Vexial can deal with that evil dragon. But the Grand Vexial has always been on good terms with that monster. His title of Pasha was recommended by the Grand Vexial, and only then did Pharaoh agree to it. Lilith added what he knew from a court. If we want the Grand Vexial and that Megalosaurus Pasha to turn against each other, we have to have a very good reason. Reason? A flying dagger appeared on the tiefling tailor's fingertips. She quickly threw it in the direction of the tent wall. Then we have to give him a reason that is enough to convince him. The flying dagger pierced through the wall of the tent. In fact, the wall, which had been treated with vinegar, seemed to have opened up by itself the moment the flying dagger came into contact with it. A muffled groan came from outside the wall. The black-robed mage clenched his fists and was about to cast a powerful lethal spell. The act of coming into contact with demons was taboo no matter which world he was in. He would not let go of any possible listener. But before he could cast his spell, a short and swift monster rushed out from the shadows of the tent. It rushed in the direction of the tailor's flying dagger and immediately dragged the listener, who had a dagger stuck in his throat, into the tent. How could it be him? Lilith recognized the dead man. He was the coachman who was supposed to be waiting in another street at this time. For a moment, the black-robed mage's mind raced, and he immediately thought of a possibility. He's a sniffer who is lurking around me. Lilith could not help but turn pale with fright. They're under the jurisdiction of the Grand Vader. After a while, the black-robed mage noticed the little monster that had just jumped out. It had been hiding in the tent all this time, and he did not notice anything unusual. Even his spell did not detect any trace of its existence. It's our assassin, the tailor explained when she saw Lilith's nervous expression. It's a half-demon, half-dog, half-human created by our great master. It's proficient in stealth, like the master of shadow thieves. When necessary, it can also make a fatal blow. Seeing that Lilith was not relieved and was even more afraid, the tiefling smiled sweetly. It's not targeted at you. In fact, the only life that the assassin wants to take is Medicus's Pharaoh. The black-robed mage's expression suddenly changed. His face turned black like a blackened iron pot. Chapter 254. As it turned out, The sailors who were familiar with sailing were always very accurate in estimating the time of the journey. That morning, the desert elf aboard set foot on the land that he had been away from for a long time, although there was still quite a distance between here and his real hometown. "Captain," a mercenary ran over, holding a papyrus with a large stamp in his hand. "All the goods have been checked by the black dwarfs. We have paid the taxes and can unload the goods and wait for the delivery." As he spoke, the mercenary winked at aboard and deliberately emphasized the word all. How could a mercenary group not smuggle some personal goods when escorting goods? In fact, smuggling personal goods had become a major feature of the mercenary industry. Every mercenary group had a unique way of smuggling, and this was listed as an industry secret and was strictly guarded. For example, aboard's Wandering Elves mercenary group would usually tamper with the containers used to transport goods. The crates and barrels that contained the fossils were made of processed wood, and there were many hidden compartments in them. These hidden compartments contained the personal goods that the mercenary group was transporting this time: saltpeter powder. According to aboard and his subordinates, this Japanese rock powder was actually a kind of alchemy material. When mixed with water, it could be used to make ice. Selling it to mages would make a lot of profit. But what these mercenaries did not know was that their captain had concealed some facts. This highly concentrated saltpeter powder could not only be used to make ice, but it could also be used to do something big. Of course, there was no need to tell everyone this. Since we have the proof of tax return, aboard shook the thin papyrus in his hand and turned to his subordinates. "What are we waiting for? Put down the ramp and unload the goods immediately. You have to know that a few days after Opat Festival, the taverns in Bite City usually have a discount. It's perfect for me to treat you." After a long journey on the sea, almost all the mercenaries were looking forward to the time to go ashore. And the words of the Desert Elf mercenary group captain were like sparks that lit up the fire in everyone's heart. After a few cheers, everyone shook off their arms and worked hard, striving to get the group leader to pay for the meal as soon as possible. Aboard gestured to his subordinate who had just gone to file the tax return. The experienced and smart mercenary immediately understood and turned to the warehouse. He had to find a spacious and secluded warehouse, and he had to find something. While they were waiting for the owner to pick up the goods and the young mercenaries were relaxing, they worked overtime with the leader to retrieve the smuggled goods in advance. He had been in this line of work for many years, so he was quite familiar with it. As the mercenaries moved the crates and barrels into the warehouse one after another, he began to work in a corner where no one was looking. Just as he was dismantling the interlayer on the 230th barrel, Aubert walked behind him with a bag of barbecued meat and a small barrel of lager. "How is it? Is there a hole in the waterproof tarpaulin?" After receiving the food, the trusted mercenary stood up. On one hand, it was convenient for Aubert to inspect, and, on the other hand, it was to prevent the juices of the barbecued meat or beer from wetting the saltpeter powder that had yet to be divided into small barrels. "Don't worry, I'll handle it." The desert elf nodded and pointed to the remaining 100 barrels that had yet to be dismantled. "Go to the sailor's home and have a drink with everyone. Tell them that today's expenses are on my account, and I'll be responsible for the rest of the work." The old mercenary naturally knew when to give up, so after bowing and thanking him, he left the warehouse while humming a tune. Aubert left the door of the warehouse ajar, and after some effort, he put all the saltpeter powder into the small barrels and sealed them tightly. He reached out his palm and aimed at the small barrels that were piled up. A light flashed on the worm plate armor, hidden under his robe, and hundreds of acid mist worms gushed out from the iron gauntlet and wrapped around the small barrels filled with saltpeter powder. Then, they carried the small barrels back into the iron gauntlet. "Art is an explosion." Aubert's words came out of his mouth without rhyme or reason. Then, as if he had forgotten why so many terrifying worms suddenly burst out from the armor, he ignored his own words. He still had other work to do. After leaving the temporary warehouse on the dock, the mercenary commander of the Desert Elves walked into Bite City, following the bustling crowd. Although Zhang Tai had been to Bite several times before, it was impossible for him to guarantee that he would not get lost in this huge city known as the City of 10,000 Cities on the basis of those few visits. But after putting on the worm plate armor, Obert no longer had to worry about the direction. There was a sense of urgency that drove him to the southwest of the city. He walked in a diagonal line and went straight through the capital of Medic. "Taylor, the goods have been delivered. Are the other materials I need ready?" Aubert lifted the curtain of the tent and walked into a colorful tent on Canivo Street. When he saw the familiar figure, he was no longer as polite as he was when they first met. Instead, he greeted her with harsh and cold words. "It's really neat." The tiefling female spy was dressed like a fortune-teller witch on streets. "I just sent the pot maker away, and a mercenary arrived." She sat in front of the table and pointed to the shadow that shrouded her. "The things you want are ready." Before he could finish, the kobold demon assassin hidden in the tent revealed himself and dragged the two chests out from the corner. The tailor opened the buckles on the boxes and pushed them in front of the mercenary commander. The best quality sulfur and charcoal. It was hard to tell whether it was the worm plate armor or Aubert himself. After a few hideous laughs, the desert elf mercenary commander reached out his hand to the boxes filled with sulfur and charcoal. The acidic worms rushed out in batches, swallowed the materials, and retracted back into the plate armor. Just like how a human stomach would bloat due to indigestion, Aubert's body suddenly expanded a lot, and even the plate armor on his body expanded a little. The power of the demon lord lingering on the plate armor came into play. The expansion was stopped, and the plate armor returned to its original shape. The desert elf twisted his iron glove twice, and a circular hole appeared in the center of his palm. A black acidic worm poked its head out of the hole and spat out a small mouthful of black powder. He carefully caught the powder with his other hand and roughly took a piece of papyrus from the tailor's table. Aubert used this piece of paper to hold up a small pile of powder, took off one of his iron gloves, and laid the paper flat on his palm. Finally, he chanted a one-syllable spell, and the iron glove that he was still wearing suddenly turned red due to the heat. He then used a scorching finger to ignite the powder on his other palm. Through the paper, the black powder burned fiercely, but the desert elf's palm that had taken off the armor did not feel the heat. After careful observation, the paper under the powder was also not ignited. "The quality is very good," Aubert praised, and then turned his gaze to the half-demon kobold. "You are the assassin tonight." Before he could finish his sentence, the maggot plate armor suddenly exploded, and several maggots of acid mist suddenly rushed out and bound the assassin tightly. The hole that Aubert had just opened on his iron glove had not closed, and the unique black acidic worms poked out of his body and went deep into the assassin's stomach. Remember your line, "Art is an explosion." Chapter 255. Under the control of the wormplate armor, or rather, the demon lord, aboard roughly completed the feeding of the half-demon kobold. Then, he branded a rune on the latter's body. "If you do the same thing to me," after watching the series of actions of the desert elf mercenary commander, a dangerous light flashed in the tailor's eyes. She said fiercely, "I will definitely kill you, absolutely." This warning, which sounded fierce but was actually a coward, made Abord feel an inexplicable sense of satisfaction. When he was first resurrected, he had always been under the other party's tyranny and lived in fear every day. "Don't worry, you're just a tailor. You're only in charge of sewing and mending." The desert elf chuckled and condensed another rune in his hand. "The assassin is under your control. When it finishes activating the sacrifice, crush this rune." As if he had finished talking about something insignificant, Abord turned around and left the colorful tent. He did not care about the dagger that appeared in the half-demon kobold assassin's hand and the strong murderous intent in the shadow behind him. "If you can't survive," the tailor, who looked equally unfriendly, said as she fiddled with the bracelet used to control the assassin to prevent it from following the desert elf, "I'll be the middleman and provide you with a chance to get close to the mercenary. I'm good at killing with one blow." The half-demon kobold spoke crudely and concisely, which surprised the tailor who heard it for the first time. Out of Bite City, about 10 pale sand to the west, there is a lagoon formed by several sandbanks. The Museum of the Grand Vexel was located here. Many craftsmen were nervously working in the museum. It's just a pet. The Fire Dwarf Patriarch sat in the hall of the museum that was under renovation. Even if he had copper skin and iron bones, he still needed to rest after working for 3 to 4 days. However, you humans do like to give big cats big names. For example, you call them lions. The general on duty looked at his beloved pet with dissatisfaction. This fellow actually felt wronged because the fire dwarf burned a little of its mane with his finger. It did not have the slightest majesty of the king of beasts. Don't tease this poor cat anymore. It is the only Naroya lion in existence. Looking at the two old fellows who were at daggers drawn, Commander Wenfeng immediately dissuaded them. Moreover, tonight, it is one of our main characters. With his mediation, the topic of the conversation returned to the right track. A welcoming ceremony that conforms to the standard security measures to deal with any possible crisis. The trio conversed for almost an hourglass on such topics, until the Grand Vader arrived, and they paused their discussion. Your Excellency. Before the straightforward fire dwarf could say noble young man, which was how he usually addressed Pharaoh, Commander Wenfeng asked, when will His Majesty arrive? How long will he stay here? The Grand Vexil, who was wearing the purple robes of Tyr, stroked the mane of the Lion of Naroya and greeted a few of his old companions. Only then did he answer Commander Wenfeng's question with a dispirited tone. This place will be brightly lit tonight. After saying this, he winked at the serious-looking Commander Wenfeng. Yesterday at the banquet of Opat Festival, the young pharaoh was drunk. I guess he has just woken up, so his visit will be delayed. It turned out that because the visit was delayed, they had to prepare a banquet. And the young King Medrich, who was known for his good drinking, would probably get drunk again in the museum. Many princes, ministers, nobles, and those pasha who have arrived in Bite City have all been invited to accompany Pharaoh. The Grand Vader suddenly added casually as he turned his palm into a solid rock so that he could feel the prickly tongue of the Naroya lion. The Megalosaurus Pasha should also be invited. The commander on duty, who was responsible for the security work, frowned. The powerful warrior, who had always been quiet, said, "Should we raise the level of the deployment? I heard that some people don't get along well with him, and there's even a possibility of conflict." "I think so too," the Fire Dwarf Patriarch echoed. At the same time, he gave an explanation that was in line with his identity as a master craftsman. The newly installed windows are as fragile as papyrus. If they start a fight, I'm afraid they will be broken. Ignoring the Fire Dwarf's fallacy of Polly in a special accent, Commander Wenfeng obviously agreed with the commander on duty. Your Excellency, the spy lurking around Mage Lilith did not send news on time. I'm worried that the situation has changed. He did not clearly explain his information, but he had already given the key information. As the leader of the Sniffers, who was good at planning everything in advance, in fact, he had already activated some secret spies before the Megalosaurus Pasha came to Bite City. He had deployed his own eyes and ears at any node that could cause chaos. Lilith of the Obsidian Council, who had a deep grudge with the Megalosaurus Pasha, was the focus of the Grand Vader. The spy lurking around him would record every little thing that happened around him on time every day and send it back to the headquarters of the Sniffers through magic or other means. But today, the Sniffers who served the Black Robe Mage as a coachman did not even report back that everything was normal. This made Commander Wenfeng feel uneasy. He could not help but begin to prepare for the worst. If I have to give a pension, Commander Wenfeng's nose twitched, and he secretly made up his mind. Then this debt must be put on the black-robed mage's head, and the debt must be paid back. The Grand Vader finally agreed to the plan to increase the security level. He then left the hall and returned to the laboratory built under the museum. The Fire Dwarf Patriarch also left. He had enough rest, and there was still some urgent work at hand to complete. The troops on duty have begun to set up the defense. Ask the Naroya guards to come and be on standby. I'll leave the arrangements here to you. Commander Wenfeng communicated with the general on duty. Remember to prepare weapons against both sides and be prepared for both sides. He emphasized the word both sides. The latter immediately understood. In addition to the noble mages who were trying to cause a conflict as imaginary enemies, the commander on duty had to consider the situation of the Megalosaurus Pasha and had to be prepared in advance. Commander Winfong did not make any more arrangements. First, he believed in the ability of the commander on duty. Second, although Pharaoh was escorted by guard along the way from Bite City to the museum, he still needed to carefully screen them to be at ease. Chapter 256. Quest had never thought that he would be invited to a banquet by the pharaoh on the second day of his arrival in Bite, even before he had formally paid his respects to the pharaoh. And this banquet would be held in the newly built museum in the Grand Vexel, and it would probably last until late at night. The gift is ready, the young blue dragon thought to himself. Since it was his first visit to Pharaoh, and he also wanted to better promote the products of Gnome City, he brought a specially assembled fanatic armor. I have to let Pharaoh wear it in public. The person Keyes was thinking about, the monarch of the Medici Empire, Pharaoh of Beitar. At this time, with the careful help of dozens of attendants, he was also preparing for his trip today. Pharaoh's name was inherited from his ancestors. Every pharaoh would abandon his original name after the coronation. In addition to inheriting power and responsibility, he would automatically receive the name Isinder, which originally belonged to the greatest ancient hero king of Medici. The current pharaoh was in his early 30s. He had a face that did not match the strong muscles on his body, angular bones, a tall and elegant nose, and slender cheeks. That was how he got the nickname Isinder the Handsome Man. An attendant half-bowed and walked quickly into the palace where Pharaoh lived. When he was about 10 steps away from Isinder, he knelt on one knee and crossed his hands over his chest. Your Majesty, the carriage is ready, and the Imperial Guards have also been deployed. We await your departure at any time. In response to the attendant, the pharaoh let out a loud burp. At least there's no sweet wine smell. The attendant lowered his head and sniffed, secretly rejoicing in his heart. Give me some hangover medicine made with peace bloom. Pharaoh took a cup of lavender solution from another attendant. He endured the pungent fragrance, took 2 big gulps, and ordered, "Bring more, there's a banquet tonight." After that, he shook his head helplessly, stood up, and prepared to wash his face with ice water before leaving. Although he was known as a drinker, in fact, Isinder was not the kind of drunkard that most people thought. As pharaoh, while he had the highest power given by the law, he also shouldered the responsibility of the monarch of Medici. Especially on yesterday's Opat festival, a day that closely combined festivities and patriotism education, Isinder had to be more excited than anyone else. He had to drink to his heart's content because this was a responsibility of the monarch. Today's visit to the newly completed museum of the Grand Vexel was to fulfill another responsibility. Every wise pharaoh was inseparable from the support of the people and the assistance of his many subordinates. If the pharaoh was the object of the loyalty of Medica's thousands of subjects, then the Grand Vexel was the prime minister of the empire, the leader of all Medica's ministers. This was a tradition of the empire since ancient times. Even if he secretly supported the establishment of the Obsidian Council in the hope that it could be an equal to the Grand Vexel in the future, he could not rashly subvert the tradition now. Isinder had to maintain enough respect for the Grand Vexel. Of course, respect was respect, but this trip still could not degrade the majesty of the monarch. There were many things that needed to be prepared in advance. Fortunately, Isinder had enough attendants to provide thoughtful service for their pharaoh from different angles, such as food, clothing, and guard standards. So far, 5 pashas have arrived in Bite City, and 2 more are expected to arrive within 2 hourglasses. We have arranged people at the city gates. If we meet the 2, we will directly invite them to move to the lagoon. While Eshin was washing his face with ice water, an attendant took out a few papyrus scrolls and read out the contents of the scrolls. All the information about the relationship between the officials who had attended the banquet was recorded in detail. The relationship between Zagan Pasha and Khalil Pasha has always been strained. Pay more attention during the banquet, and don't get caught up in their disputes about the territorial boundaries. The Megalosaurus Pasha has no grudges with the other ministers, and because he has some unique goods in his hands, many ministers want to establish a relationship with him. But Wizard Lilith of the Obsidian Council, Ascender, interrupted the attendant's narration. The young hungover man wiped the ice water on his face and turned back into Pharaoh, who was in charge of Medic. Send someone to inform Kanini. As the president of the Obsidian Council, he has to restrain his subordinates. Using a handkerchief embroidered with golden threads to wipe the water droplets on his face, Ascender thought for a while and called the attendant in charge of the banquet to come to him. He carefully instructed, "Arrange a private meeting with the Megalosaurus Pasha for me. Prepare my golden goblet. I want to have a good drink with him." Just like that, Pharaoh personally gave instructions to several of his confidants, tidied up his clothes, and stepped toward the gate of the palace. The convoy did not go through the gate on the west side of Bite City, but went straight north. Under the escort of the Imperial Guards, Pharaoh, wearing a stoat cloak and a pointed hat that symbolized the majesty of the empire, boarded his ship amidst the cheers of the crowd. This majestic three-decked sailboat was decorated with gilded gold, painted with the coat of arms of lions and creatures of the sea. It was covered with a dark red canopy, and it required the combined efforts of 264 oarsmen to sail out of the royal pier. Under the afternoon sun, the oars protruding from both sides of the ship seemed to be dyed gold, and they slapped the surface of the sea in unison. At the bow of the ship, a decorative figure symbolizing progress held a scythe sword high, and Medica's swallow-tailed flag fluttered in the wind at the top of the mast. Salutes were fired, the wind music was deafening, and the drums were endless. Surrounded by a large group of guard boats, the golden ship sailed along the coastline to the lagoon in the west. The attendant in charge of the procession stood in the center of the upper deck, holding the ceremonial document that Pharaoh had just signed, and loudly recited the prayer. "In the name of the glorious Pharaoh of Medic, bless this ship and all the people sailing on the sea, so that the sea will always be peaceful." After that, the Pharaoh took off a ring with a ruby embedded in it from his finger and threw it into the sea. "Oh, sea, let's tie the knot with you to show that we are your true and eternal master." Following Pharaoh's words, several mages in black robes walked to both sides of the ship. They chanted incantations to fill the sails with magic wind. They summoned water elements to carry the golden ship and its escorts forward at a faster speed. After a series of rituals, Eshin did not listen to the advice of the attendants, which was rare for him, and stayed on the deck where the wind was howling. No matter how fancy the words were, Pharaoh knew very well that the wealth hidden in the sea could not be won easily. If he wanted Medic to become more prosperous and even stand at the top of the countries in the Ashen world, he had to find a commodity that could be widely recognized by other countries and easily open their doors. Gold, more gold, Eshin muttered to himself. He looked at the sparkling surface of the sea, which looked like gold that had been hammered flat. Chapter 257. What an ostentatious person. Keyes couldn't help but find it funny as he looked at the procession of golden ships passing by on the sea. It's only a short distance of a dozen parasangs. Instead of taking the main road, they chose to take the longer route by sea. Of course, he was only ridiculing in his heart. There was no need for everyone to know. After receiving the invitation to the museum's banquet, the few Pasha who were already living in the reception apartment discussed and decided to set off together. Other than the young blue dragon, these Pasha all brought their own guards and formed a majestic fleet. "Good day, Sir Keyes." Zagan Pasha, who ruled a large archipelago in the north of Medic, rode a six-legged horse to the left of the young blue dragon and greeted him eagerly. At the same time, he asked his attendant to bring a wooden bucket and put it on the Megalosaurus Pasha's carriage. The archipelago is barren, so there are no good gifts to give. However, this is the best batch of tear purple this year. It's best to use it to dye clothes. The color won't fade for decades. I hope you can accept it. As the owner of the scale of Perpetual Order, Keyes was very familiar with the local specialties of Medic. Of course, he knew that Zagan Pasha was being polite. The tear purple produced by the archipelago was comparable to gold of the same quality. Look at what you're saying. He waved his hand and signaled his one-eyed, crooked-mouthed brother to put away the expensive gift. I should have visited you yesterday, but because it was too late, I couldn't make it. I have also prepared a small gift for you. I hope you can accept it. Saying this, he got up and took out a bronze box from the back of the carriage and opened it in front of Zagan Pasha. Under the light of the setting sun, the items in the bronze box shone with a luxurious light. The other Pasha also looked over curiously. The fanatic armor is a specialty of Gnome City. It can greatly increase the strength and agility of the wearer. Keyes explained with a smile, but it seemed like he was boasting. An ordinary fanatic armor has to be removed after 2 or 3 hourglasses of intense activity. Then, it has to be soaked in a special alchemy potion before it can recover its activity. However, this armor was different. It was the best of the best. The silver coating on its surface was not only for decoration, but also for engraving a special magic circle to provide the armor with greater endurance and power. The flesh and muscles on it never need to be removed or soaked. As long as an obsidian magic orb is changed every 2 days, this fanatic armor will continue to be active and provide protection for the wearer. Under Zagan's delighted gaze, the young blue dragon handed over the bronze box containing the refined silver fanatic armor to him. Then, the generous Megalosaurus Pasha gave the same gift to the other Pasha, who looked at him curiously. For a moment, the atmosphere in the convoy became lively. The Pasha who received the gift were full of praise for the exquisite refined silver fanatic armor. More or less, they also returned the gift and greeted Keyes. As for the sociable Zagan, he couldn't wait to put on the armor given to him by the Megalosaurus Pasha. With the effect of the fanatic armor, he even temporarily forgot the noble status of the Pasha and performed somersaults in the air like a clown. Keyes was well aware of the purpose of his actions. He wanted nothing more than to gain the young blue dragon as an ally for the archipelago territory. It would be best if he could also add an air transport route. The archipelago territory was located at the northern border of Medici. It had many natural deep-water harbors, and a large number of mixed-blood descendants of the natives and Medici immigrants lived there. The islanders had never been good at taking care of crops. Most of their food was imported from the territories of other Pasha, but they were very keen on sailing adventures. The sailors of the archipelago territory were famous for their skills and courage. However, the sailors of the archipelago territory were a bit too bold recently. In order to pursue benefits, some of them even gave up their contracts with their employers and threw themselves into depraved piracy. In the waters of the archipelago territory, the pirates were still somewhat restrained because they were afraid of the powerful merchant ships. However, in the nearby coastal areas, their actions could be said to be unscrupulous. The rampant pirates, the burned coastal villages, and the small-scale plagues brought about by death, all of these finally angered the ruler of the coastal areas adjacent to the archipelago territory, Halil Pasha. With revenge as the slogan, the pirates' encirclement and suppression operations began with the goal of annihilation. The pirates of the archipelago territory might have been the best sailors, but they were not disciplined and well-trained warriors. Therefore, it didn't take long for most of the pirates to be pierced by sharp wooden sticks and hung near their nests as a warning to future generations. However, Halil Pasha didn't want to stop. Or rather, he didn't want to stop before he obtained enough benefits to compensate for his losses. The Pasha constantly pressured Zagan, who ruled the archipelago territory, to see to few port cities as a measure of repentance for failing to supervise the residents' participation in piracy. He also cut off the sea trade route that transported agricultural products to the archipelago territory. In fact, a large part of the reason why Zagan of the archipelago territory rushed to bite on Opat Day was to ask Pharaoh to come forward and mediate the dispute that had lasted for several months. He wanted to quickly restore the food supply of the archipelago territory. This was also the purpose of showing goodwill to Keyes. Zagan hoped to open up an air route for the archipelago territory to alleviate the unfavorable situation of relying solely on sea transportation and being restricted by Halil's unfavorable situation. Since the archipelago was isolated beyond the seas, it was a rather important trade hub for Medici. However, to open up an air transportation route for the archipelago would most likely require investing resources to cultivate one or two new behemoths. In the early days of the scale of perpetual order, without the support of resources obtained from the archipelago world, Keys couldn't mass-produce the derivatives of Leviathan. Therefore, many air routes like the one leading to the archipelago territory only existed in the planning stage. Now that he had the archipelago world as his backing, Keys had confidence. It was indeed the best time to build the air routes that had been planned. However, the situation of the archipelago territory was a bit special. The conflict between Zagan and Halil had yet to be resolved. Rashly providing an air route for one side might cause hostility from the other side. Maybe Halil Pasha will also be interested in this matter. The young blue dragon thought of an idea. The convoy continued to move forward. Because the road on land was straighter, the convoy of the Pasha arrived at the lagoon before Pharaoh's golden ship. However, they weren't the first invitees to arrive here. Many nobles and princes were already prepared to welcome the monarch. The surface of the lagoon was divided by sandbars of different sizes, which made it look a bit fragmented. At this time, almost every sandbar was crowded with people. The nobles of Bite had built awnings to shelter them, but no one rested under the awnings embroidered with family patterns. They were all crowded on the shore, looking in the direction of the sea, waiting for Pharaoh's golden ship to appear. Finally, when the eternal blaze began to disappear into the sea, a dazzling golden light reflected in everyone's eyes. Pharaoh Essidor stood at the bow of the ship, waving to the people waiting for him. Unlike the others, after arriving at the lagoon, Keys didn't deliberately welcome Pharaoh's arrival. The Megalosaurus Pasha's attention was immediately attracted by the newly built museum in the Grand Vexel, and he wandered into it on his own. Similar to the other buildings in Medici, this museum was composed of sturdy wooden and stone houses. A wall made of bricks and stones surrounded a courtyard about 100 yards deep. Judging from the unfinished floor tiles, this would be an extremely spacious square in the future. On the left wing was a row of messy short houses, mostly made of wood. Looking at the fire dwarf craftsman going in and out, Keys guessed that it should be a shed. When a museum's renovation was completed, it would probably be dismantled. The right wing occupied most of the southern part of the courtyard. There was a tall stone building, which was obviously the main body of the museum. Its architectural style was similar to the palace in Medici, with small round arches on the door and windows. It was divided into 3 levels, top, middle, and bottom. The bricks were still very new. What interested Keys the most was a building in the depths of the courtyard, near the edge of the southern wall. It was not an exaggeration to call it a work of art. The building was pyramid-shaped, and the walls were all made of glass embedded in iron frames. It shone beautifully under the setting sun. That's a greenhouse. It's also the main building of this venue. Without looking back, Keys, who was standing at the highest point of the right-wing tower, recognized the voice of the visitor. I've long heard of the name of the pickaxe fire dwarf craftsman under the Grand Vexer. Today I've finally seen their craftsmanship. It's really a masterpiece. Without the panic of ordinary people after being caught, and without explaining why they broke into the tower without permission, the young blue dragon just pretended to be convinced and praised the museum generously. As the owner of this place, the Grand Vexer did not feel offended at all. Instead, he explained to Keys in more detail. The glass pyramid is actually a hatching nest. I recently had some new ideas. Using the soul binding sorcerer's chimera craft, coupled with special genetic material extracted from fossils, I cultivated some ancient creatures. They're all kept there. Tonight's banquet is also there. Looking down at the gradually increasing number of people inside the square, many palace servants began to go in and out of the glass pyramid to ensure safety. After all, Pharaoh will also attend the banquet. Well, he should have arrived already. Chapter 258. Keyes' suggestion was not unreasonable. In fact, before the museum's visitors arrived, Commander Winfong, who was very careful, had already checked the security work many times, hoping to avoid any oversights. I'm going to greet His Majesty. If Sir Pasha is interested in this place, feel free to visit as long as you don't miss the banquet. He didn't seem to mind the young blue dragon wandering alone in the museum. When he saw the golden ship anchored, the Grand Vexual politely greeted him and left first. Before teleporting away, he also thoughtfully called 2 attendants for Keyes as tour guides. Quest didn't reject this kind offer. He expressed his intention to take a tour of the glass pyramid before the banquet started, and there weren't many visitors. Then, Quest followed the attendant who led the way down the tower, passed through the courtyard, and entered the pyramid-shaped greenhouse. They walked into a green passage shaded by palm trees on both sides. There were large areas of carefully cultivated ferns everywhere, making people feel that they were entering a new world, a prehistoric tropical world, while leaving the real world behind. At the end of the green passageway, there was a huge parquet floor. On the floor, there was an exquisite painting. Crocodiles were crouching around a pond, lions were chasing antelopes, and heavily armored warriors were fighting in pairs. Many seats and tables were placed here, and some attendants, who were obviously dressed as palace servants, were tirelessly adjusting every tablecloth, every angle of every seat, and carefully filling the containers on the tables with wine that had obviously been chilled. "We will wait for about an hourglass." The guide bowed and explained to the Megalosaurus Pasha, "The banquet will be held here." Keyes nodded, indicating that he was clear about the schedule. At this time, his attention was attracted by some other interesting things. Accompanied by a loud roar, a ferocious lion suddenly leaped out from behind a fireplace that was pressed against a marble pillar. It opened its bloody mouth and pounced towards Quest and his 2 tour guides with a gust of fishy wind. Although they knew that it was actually a pet raised by the patriarch on duty, the 2 guides were still frightened. They were so nervous that they almost left the Megalosaurus Pasha and ran away first. Of course, the Naroya lion didn't want to hunt prey. In fact, it just wanted to scare strangers who had just come to its territory. When it reached the bluestone road for people to walk on, the big cat stopped and revealed its true form. Proudly, it glanced at the 3 people standing in the same place, flicked its tail, patted its butt, and was about to turn and leave. But at this moment, an irresistible pressure shrouded its body. If it didn't care about its face, the Naroya lion would have peed its pants. Just like the hot copper lump that it hated the most, the terrifying creature reached out its hand and wrapped it around its neck. It dragged it to its side and began to rub its proud, shiny mane. It's really a kitten in a greenhouse. After playing with it for a while, Keyes let go of the Naroya lion. The latter quickly ran into the grass without looking back. However, it seems to be an extinct creature, right? In the face of the Megalosaurus Pasha's question, which was actually a secret that was about to be made public, the 2 guides naturally told him everything they knew. As knowledgeable as you are, it is indeed an extinct lion. It is an Naroya lion less than a year old, so that's how it is. Listening to the explanation of the 2 guides, Keyes immediately associated it with his previous doubts about the fossils in amber on the Grand Bazaar's purchase and sale guide. From the looks of it, the sudden appearance of this extinct creature should have something to do with it. The Great Vader, how many extinct creatures did he resurrect? And what are they? The young blue dragon suddenly became interested. Judging from the past contact, Alan, who was the reincarnation of a soul-binding sorcerer, had always been a decisive person. It should be impossible for him to spend so much energy and resources just because of a sudden whim. Reporting back to you, the creatures resurrected by the Great Vader are mainly divided into 2 categories, plants and animals. Among them, there are slightly more than 10 kinds of ferns planted in this greenhouse, 2 or 3 kinds of lichen moss, and some trees. There are only 6 kinds of animals that were resurrected, namely the 8-legged crocodile, the spiny lizard, the flame-coated salamander, the velociraptor, and the Naroya lion that you have just seen. The 2 guides supplemented each other and answer the questions raised by the Megalosaurus Pasha in as much detail as possible. While talking, they walked along the bluestone road all the way to the depths of the glass pyramid. The road under their feet was much more solid than the surrounding soil due to the reinforcement of magic. Many kinds of animals, not just the ones that had been resurrected, roamed the small forest and wandered freely. But the 5 kinds of animals that belonged to the top of the food chain and were resurrected were the same as the Naroya lion. They would consciously avoid the bluestone paved road. According to the 2 attendants who acted as guides, the reason why they were alienated from this road was because the Great Vader had experienced too many failures when resurrecting them, and the fossil waste was all mixed with other materials by the fire dwarves and made into a cement for the bluestone. For the animals that were originally extinct, they might feel uncomfortable near this road. It is also possible that His Excellency the Great Vader cast a spell to protect us who work here. The other guide added to his companion's words, but he also admitted, many of those abandoned fossil bones are buried here. Keyes became a qualified listener at this time, and he did not comment on the explanations provided by the guides. In fact, the Great Vader's act of resurrecting extinct creatures reminded him of the famous Jurassic World movies in his previous life. But what really surprised him was that in addition to the 5 kinds of reptiles, the Great Vader actually used the method of soul-binding sorcerers to resurrect the Naroya lion, a mammal. It should be known that the mammal's red blood cells did not have a nucleus. It was almost impossible to extract any genetic material that could replicate the Naroya lion from the insect trapped in amber. And to extract enough protein from the fossil to reverse the replication, even with the help of magic, the technical content and the amount of work required was probably quite astonishing. Why resurrect the big cat? Keyes could not figure it out for a while. While he was pondering, a burst of cymbals and drums came from the entrance of the glass pyramid behind him. Chapter 259. The surfaces of the wooden seats were polished, the tablecloths were brand new, and the marble floor was spotless. The eternal blaze hanging high in the sky had set, but the glass pyramid was as bright as day. A large number of torches were inserted at the top of the marble pillars, and there were 5 or 6 bonfires lit on the ground. Due to the ventilation channel, the smoke rose into the air and gathered into a puff before quickly dissipating. Without the guidance of others, Keyes quickly found his seat according to the name tag that had been pasted on the wall. In fact, the palace servants were too busy to care about anything else. They shuttled between the guests and nervously presented the food for dinner. In order to take into account the preferences of each invited guest, the food at the banquet was plentiful, including almost all the specialties of Medic. There was braised cod that was popular in the archipelago, roasted snake with spicy sauce that was famous in Bite City, and hot crab pie. On his own table, Keyes even found the delicacies of the Nome region, braised camel steak and lemon duck. After tasting the lemon duck with a turnip boiled in butter, the young blue dragon ate a large piece of camel steak. Although he didn't want to admit it, compared to the palace chefs of Bite, the gourmet brew, who had also cooked these dishes, was simply wasting the ingredients. Unlike the banquet customs in his previous life, the Medic banquet usually let the invited guests fill their stomachs first before the host of the banquet appeared. At that time, the banquet became a purely social banquet. At this time, most of the guests were drinking and enjoying their own dinner. Only a few people, such as Zagan Pasha, tried to strike up a conversation with others with food in order to seek more help. Holding a pot of braised cod, which was made by filling the belly of a puffin and fermenting it for a long time, the ruler of the archipelago slowly walked to Keyes' side while chatting with others. "Your Excellency Keyes, you have to try this delicacy from the archipelago." Zagan smiled and handed the spicy braised cod to the young blue dragon. "I have to admit that the chefs in His Majesty's palace make this food in a very authentic way." Just as Keyes blocked his sense of smell for the sake of etiquette and was about to poke a small piece of the braised cod with a silver fork, a stranger came to his rescue. Using vomit as a delicacy. Only the archipelago has such a dirty habit. "Halil, you old bastard. Feeling insulted, Zagan Pasha angrily threw down the braised cod and scolded him with his fingers spread open. For a moment, many pairs of eyes were attracted by his loud scolding and converged on this side. The archipelago of the archipelago and the archipelago of the archipelago. However, looking at the way the two of them were scolding each other, Keyes did not think that their relationship was as simple as a rift. Perhaps it was more accurate to say that they hated each other deeply. You pirate leader, you are just like a boastful seagull. Enraged by Zagan's series of greetings in the archipelago's dialect, the square-faced Halil fiercely retorted, I hope you plunge into the sea and drown there forever. Zagan Pasha was not to be outdone. You stupid donkey who is used to slander others. Didn't the residents of the archipelago inform you when we were clearing out the pirates? Now you are actually making a false accusation and coveting other people's land. The two Pasha did not care about their identities and scolded loudly. However, they clearly knew their limits. They did not affect others and did not use any means other than words to attack each other. The scolding continued for a while, and then someone stepped forward. A few warriors wearing half-body plate armor walked over. Their attitude was modest, but they forcefully separated the two Pasha and put an end to this sudden farce. From the blazing sun pattern on the warriors' attire, Keyes guessed that they belonged to the Day Watchman under the Great Weasel. However, in addition to the Day Watchman, he clearly felt that there were several fierce auras locked onto this place at the same time. It seemed that the security level of this banquet was not low. There were people watching every invited guest at all times. However, it made sense after thinking about it. After all, Medica's pharaoh was here. The banquet continued for about half an hourglass. With the sound of cymbals being struck, everyone consciously put down their cutlery. Keyes was naturally no exception. The host of this banquet, the Great Weasel, who was wearing a purple robe and a golden mask, followed behind Pharaoh from the corridor at the end of the open-air hall. The melodious sound of the flute accompanied the drum music to play a song called Friendship with Essendor. At this moment, everyone, whether it was the palace servants, the guards on guard duty, the invited nobles of Bite, or the Pasha from all over the world, stood up straight and began to sing this song of praise to Medica's ancient hero king. Good health, everyone. At the end of Friendship with Essendor, Pharaoh walked to the center of the hall and took the lead to greet everyone who had been invited to this banquet. May Pharaoh's holy reign last forever, and Medica's glory last forever. The young blue dragon felt that the Pharaoh seemed to have glanced at him and revealed a friendly smile. He did not know if he had seen wrongly. Of course, this possibility was very small, but the young blue dragon felt that the Pharaoh seemed to have glanced at him and revealed a friendly smile. I just heard the noise. Sitting on the largest chair in the hall, Essendor immediately said, Zagan Pasha, Khalil Pasha, I already know about your dispute. Hearing this, the two involved hurriedly walked out of the crowd, put their hands on their chests, and bowed. They first apologized to King Medic, then defended themselves. Khalil was still a little reserved, but the younger Zagan simply turned into a tearful mess. The ruler of the archipelago, at this time, did not care about the dignity of a pasha. He cried and complained, Your Majesty, please uphold justice for the innocent islanders. Old Pasha, Khalil Pasha, has banned the food transportation route of the archipelago. They're already starving. I've never seen such a shameless person. Khalil, who had almost been called an old man, was already furious. If not for the presence of the Pharaoh and the Great Vader, as well as the numerous Day Watchmen, he would have punched the bastard Zagan a long time ago. Your Majesty, the reason why I chose to resort to force is because the coastal territory was attacked by the pirates of the archipelago and several villages and towns were massacred. And I completed the campaign against the pirates and restored peace to Medica's northern waters. When I wanted to ask for compensation from Zagan, who failed to control his people, he tried to shirk his responsibility in every possible way. Khalil Pasha's statement was reasonable, and for a moment, it was approved by many of the nobles of Bite. Many of them were actually merchants who did business, and the pirates in Medica's northern waters would indeed hurt their business. Essendor nodded. Although intervening in this dispute was not in line with the advice given by his advisor, the conversation with the Grand Vader just now had given him some new ideas. I have always been cautious in supporting the claim for compensation from the innocent victims. He comforted Zagan with his eyes, or rather, he stopped Zagan from refuting and continued, but I'm still very dissatisfied with the abuse of violence, especially the blockade of our country's shipping routes. The Grand Vader, who stood beside him without saying a word, took out 2 papyrus scrolls from his sleeves and presented them with a slight bow. Since Essinder already knew the contents of the scrolls, after receiving them, he directly distributed them to the 2 Pasha for a look. Khalil Pasha, your losses will be compensated. Zagan Pasha, please rest assured that I will not let my people starve. Looking at the expressions of the 2 Pasha, Essinder said rather proudly, but from now on, you 2 must sincerely cooperate. The archipelago domain has enough sailors, and they are all willing to transport goods for your majesty, Zagan answered first. The supervisors of my farms and mines can also be used to exhaust the energy of those people at any time. Khalil was also unwilling to fall behind. Standing not far from the 2, Keyes used his keen eyesight to take a quick glance. After thinking for a while, he figured out the whole story. Because the Wozing Empire was unable to compensate for the remaining war debts, they hoped to use the slaves in the Zhejiang talent market to offset the debt. However, the previous pharaoh had changed the constitution long ago. Except for convicted criminals in Bite City, the slave trade was completely banned in the empire. At that time, some islands in the archipelago domain had not yet been discovered and colonized by the Medic, so they could be counted as an exception. Therefore, Pharaoh took advantage of this loophole and turned the disputed island between Zagan and Khalil into a special slave trade zone. The 2 sides jointly built and profited from it, but it was managed by the mages of the Obsidian Council sent by Pharaoh. In this way, not only would Khalil's losses be compensated, but Zagan of the archipelago domain would also have something to say to the islanders. At the same time, more obsidian magic beads could be supplied to the Obsidian Council. It was like killing 3 birds with 1 stone. The only one who did not benefit from this was the Grand Vader, who had almost single-handedly facilitated this matter. From the few limited contacts he had with the Grand Vader, Keyes did not think that he was really so selfless. There must be hidden intentions in this matter that no one knew about. However, apart from Keyes, the other guests present did not have the time to think about these questions. Now, let's move on to the banquet after dinner. The Grand Vader, who was wearing a golden mask, stretched out a palm, and a magic staff appeared out of thin air. He tapped the tip of the magic staff on the ground. I also have some new friends, and I would like to invite everyone to visit them. At first, some people were not interested, but the place where the Grand Vexer tapped his staff, many runic languages suddenly jumped out. These runes suddenly turned into dazzling yellow halos that kept pulsating, surrounding everyone in the middle. Chapter 260. The bright runes evolved into scrolls, and in the surprised eyes of the guests at the banquet, they turned into animals that should have been extinct. 8-legged crocodiles, spike-tailed lizards, flame-coated salamanders, velociraptors, and tortoises. In the end, a Naroya lion suddenly appeared in the light and shadow and slowly walked toward the crowd. Why? A bite noble, and the people around him whispered. Why is the Grand Vader performing illusion? But before the person's voice died away, the Naroya lion opened its bloody mouth and let out a deafening roar. It recognized Keyes, who had bullied it not long ago. Taking advantage of the fact that the general on duty was following behind, it acted recklessly. Only then did the people present realize that the lion was really the kind of beast that had been extinct for hundreds of years. It was the kind of companion of Medica's ancient hero king, Essendor, and the kind of character that always appeared in legends. The Grand Vader has resurrected a Naroya lion. Look, there's a piece of black hair at the end of its claws. It walks like a dance and steps like a meteor. The Naroya lion's neck has a circle of white hair that looks like broken runes. This lion really has it. The whispers of discussion grew louder and louder. At this moment, even Pharaoh was interested in this creature and eagerly sought an answer from the Grand Vader. Is this really the Naroya lion? Is it an ancient species, or it was born less than 10 years ago? I resurrected it from an ancient fossil through magic. The Grand Vader bowed slightly and replied calmly with one hand on his chest. Then he turned to the guests in the open-air hall. Without any movement, the Grand Vader transmitted his words to everyone's ears with a spell of amplification. Except for the Naroya lion, all the creatures in the rune images that you have seen just now are the species that I have newly resurrected. Hearing this, some knowledgeable Bite nobles, especially the mages of the Obsidian Council, all held their breaths in shock. They knew that the Grand Vader's strength was the best in Medic, but they didn't know that it was so powerful. Creation was always much more difficult than destruction, and reviving creatures that had been buried in the river of history was even more difficult. Asking themselves honestly, even the young blue dragon present had to admit that the technology they used to create the Leviathan behemoth was far inferior to the great dimensional technique. However, why would he waste energy and resources to revive these extinct creatures? Everyone was eager to know the answer. Apparently, the Grand Vader did not intend to keep this a secret. The world we live in is full of ashes. Except for a limited number of islands, the desert covers almost all the known land. He glanced at everyone present and said, "This undoubtedly restricts the reproduction of human beings. After all, we lack land for farming, and the food can't bear the excessive consumption of the population." But in ancient times, this land was actually covered by vegetation. Lush forests, vast and beautiful grasslands, and countless animals inhabit them. Vitality fills the earth. The reason why I resurrect these extinct animals, as well as the plants that you haven't noticed, is because I want to replicate the ancient ecological environment and use this as an opportunity to strive to revive the vitality of the entire Medic and even the Ash world in the future. There was a moment of silence in the open-air hall. Everyone present was shocked by the idea put forward by the Grand Vader. But after a few breaths, someone took the lead and cheered. The entire glass pyramid was in an uproar in an instant. Everyone was enthusiastically discussing the changes that would take place in the future of the Ash world, imagining the magnificent scene of herds of horses, crisscross fields, and the skyrocketing number of Medic people occupying every corner of the world. The Grand Vader was very satisfied with the reaction of the scene. In fact, this was also the purpose of the banquet that he had held to cater to Pharaoh. Even though after the deal with Kanini, he had obtained scarce materials and successfully completed the experiment of reviving ancient creatures. But if he wanted to defeat the desert and fulfill his ambition, he still couldn't do without the support of the Medic class present. Taking advantage of the warm atmosphere, Pharaoh Essiender immediately announced the start of the banquet. Pots of wine were brought up by the palace servants. The oak barrels filled with bubbling beer exuded the cold air that had just been chilled. The strong liquor, known as the water of fire, sat quietly in the glass bottles. The expensive wine from Kittian County had been mixed with honey, mixed with many spices, just as the two Pasha, Zagan and Khalil, who had just let bygones be bygones, walked side by side to propose a toast. Keys, wanting to discuss with him, the Megalosaurus Pasha, about the addition of the floating behemoth air transport route, an attendant of Pharaoh suddenly squeezed over. After apologizing, he extended an invitation to the young blue dragon on behalf of his master. Lord Megalosaurus Pasha, the attendant with a respectful expression, said politely in the Medic official language with a Bite dialect, "Pharaoh has heard of your great name and praised your wise command in the battle against the Japanese invasion. Today, I have specially brought a golden goblet and would like to have a drink with you." Since the monarch of Medic, the object of his nominal loyalty, invited him, Keys naturally had to give enough respect. First, he promised the two Pasha that he would consider their proposal. Then, under the guidance of Pharaoh's attendant, he passed through the bustling crowd and walked to the corridor at the end of the open-air hall. Stepping into the corridor, Keys discovered that this place was a completely different world. At the corner of the corridor, there was a small pavilion hidden among the green leaves. Pharaoh, who had just found an excuse to temporarily leave the banquet, was now drinking by himself here. Seeing the arrival of the Megalosaurus Pasha, Essinder smiled and walked over, patting Keys' shoulder as a gesture of intimacy. Then, he invited him to join them at the banquet, drinking as they chatted. During the banquet, the invited president of the Obsidian Council was drinking and chatting with a few Bite nobles he was familiar with. However, Kanini's mind was completely focused on the important news that the Great Vexil had just released. Because he was too engrossed in his thoughts, the quick-witted Count did not pay attention to the target of his trip, the black-robed wizard Lilith. However, Lilith was only a minor character, and Kanini did not take him seriously. However, due to the nature of their race, demons were very sensitive to anything related to demons. Kanini's nose suddenly smelled a stench unique to the demons of Tower. Not good. An ear-piercing clamor rang out. Art is an explosion, followed by a huge explosion containing destruction and chaos. Chapter 261. The light was disturbed by the surrounding plants, causing the pavilion to be mottled with light and darkness. This made the appearance of the half-demon kobold even more frightening. This was all thanks to the shadow. Its appearance, coupled with the shadow's contrast, made it seem as if it wanted to take someone's life. In fact, this fellow did have such intentions. For the great cause of Pasha, the half-demon kobold muttered softly after reciting the established lines in a rough voice, "You foolish mortal king, you will die without a doubt." Before it finished speaking, the place where it was standing was struck by a bolt of lightning, and a large, smoking crater appeared. Keys used his actions to express his attitude towards this uninvited guest who had suddenly appeared and said something that put him in a passive position. However, the other party was not as powerless as he thought. It was only the half-demon kobold Shadow that was electrocuted. With a skill comparable to the best of shadow thieves, it relied on the shadows here to teleport directly behind Essidor. "Careful," the young blue dragon warned. However, even if he did not say anything, Pharaoh would still be safe under this attack. 3 sharp arrows shot out from the leaves at the same time, forming a triangle, blocking the path of the assassin's dagger at an extremely tricky angle. As for the Pharaoh himself, it was out of the young blue dragon's expectations that he was also a master. Facing the half-demon kobold right in front of him, Essidor's powerful blast punch accurately landed on its forehead. However, with a soft, poochy sound, the assassin's figure shattered once again, and the one that attacked the Pharaoh was still a shadow that it had created using its skill. Taking advantage of this, a few warriors wearing half-body armor had already surrounded the pavilion, firmly protecting Pharaoh in the middle. Because they had heard the assassin's words, they could not completely trust the Megalosaurus Pasha. These people who appeared at this time were all members of the Naroya Guard. They were the elite forces of the Pharaoh Imperial Guard. To become a Naroya Guard, after passing the test and proving one's loyalty and bravery, one had to voluntarily complete a special ceremony. During the ceremony, they would drink the blood of a powerful wer-beast and become a Narrowan Lion Man. Not only would this change greatly increase their individual strength, but it would also allow them to have a far sharper sense of smell than ordinary people. It was because of this that they were able to constantly lock onto the assassin in the shadows. However, the half-demon kobold's speed was still a little too fast. It was difficult for the Naroya guards to lock onto its exact location, let alone launch an attack on it. Fortunately, this group of guards with nearly 1,000 years of history had plenty of experience in dealing with such situations, ensuring that they could complete their mission. Beast transformation. Under the command of their leader, all of the guards quickly completed their transformation. Their already knotted muscles swelled up once more, and they turned into wer-creatures with beastly heads and human bodies. The leader of the Naroya Guard estimated the position of the assassin and immediately took out a smoke crystal and threw it over. This weapon, which looked like a dart, did not pin the opponent, but only made a slight whistling sound as it cut through the air. Chapter 262. Pot Maker. Strolling in the streets and alleys in the southeast of Byte City, a hooded pedestrian murmured to himself, "Using me as a scapegoat, it's not a waste of my carefully prepared escape plan." The person walking was none other than the black-robed mage Lilith himself, or rather, the cloned body that he had prepared in advance. As early as when he came back from Nome, he had thought of changing his body. After the assassination at the banquet of the Grand Dimensional Museum, this clone body was just right for him to use. However, although he had temporarily escaped from a lot of trouble, Lilith still warned himself that he could not be careless. He had to find a way to evacuate from Byte City at the fastest speed overnight. In order not to be tracked down, he could not use the means of magic transmission, because it would emit magic waves that could not be covered at all. Moreover, whether it was the Grand Dimensional Museum, the Obsidian Council, or the terrible wizard who looked like a lich beside the Megalosaurus Pasha, they should be able to determine the location of the transmission by analyzing the magic waves. Therefore, Lilith had to use some traditional means to leave Byte City, whose gate had been blocked. Most of these traditional means were used to smuggle goods. Generally speaking, it would cost a lot of money to use them to let a living person escape. After turning left and right for a long time in the streets and alleys, Lilith came to a shop located at the junction of the southwest and southeast of Byte City. Because he had made a plan in advance, he could find the den of the underground smugglers so easily. Just like gerbils who lived in burrows, and each burrow had hundreds of rodents, the people of the underworld in Byte City had designed a complicated warning system. Shouting, whistling, nodding, and even simple body gestures were used as a way to transmit information. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. The black-robed mage did not say anything, but just made a gesture and said a few words to express his intention. And the leader of the smugglers, who received a small bag of silver cats, also said clearly, "You can go out tonight." 2 smugglers were appointed by their boss to lead the way for this business partner. Lilith followed them and began to trudge through the streets and alleys again. However, unlike what he had expected, they did not enter a secret passage, but went to the terminal building near the wall of Byte City. "Why did you come here?" Seeing the floating behemoth, Lilith immediately stopped in his tracks. An obsidian magic orb appeared in his hand. "Isn't this the property of the Megalosaurus Pasha?" You're right." One of the smugglers interrupted the black-robed mage. Since the other party had settled the bill, their attitude became more perfunctory. "We have a batch of goods to transport. You can board the cabin of the floating behemoth as one of the escorts. It's also the fastest and most convenient way to leave Beitar tonight." Lilith was not satisfied with this answer. Even though half of his face was hidden in the shadow of the hood, the smuggler standing in front of him could still tell that the guest was not in a good mood from the trembling of his nose and lips. But so what? Lifting his waistcoat and revealing a foot-long dagger, the smuggler lowered his voice and said, "We don't want to cause trouble." His companion was keeping a lookout for him. "Besides, the money you gave is only enough to buy the way. You still have to pay for the burying." Lilith, who was rarely threatened, smiled. "I understand." Just as he was about to cast a spell and turn the 2 minions into a pool of pus, he suddenly saw a familiar figure. "I don't want to cause trouble, at least not now." Seeing that Lilith had admitted defeat, the 2 smugglers looked at each other and sneered. They waved their hands and asked Lilith to follow them. Although the service was terrible, this route was really safe. At least with the black-robed mage. After the 3 of them showed the list of goods, they were allowed to enter the terminal without any inspection. It was just that when they were about to board the suspension cabin below the Leviathan derivative, a few kobold spacemen from the Dragonborn clan asked them a few questions below the mooring tower, especially to Lilith, who was in charge of escorting the cargo. They reminded him that he could use the method of swallowing saliva to relieve the discomfort caused by the change in pressure in his ears when ascending and descending. After finishing their work, the 2 smugglers disguised as shop assistants stayed for a while and left, leaving the black-robed mage to occupy a corner of the warehouse, quietly waiting for the floating behemoth to take off. Why did she appear near the terminal? The figure that had just appeared made Lilith a little uneasy. If he had a choice, he would rather have never come into contact with her before. Could it be the demon also has designs on this floating behemoth? It was none other than the female tiefling spy that Lilith had seen in the tent on Kaniwo Street before. Her code name was Taylor. Just when the black-robed mage was worried about whether the Taylor would do something that might affect his escape plan, the female tiefling spy was also full of worry. The mercenaries, wearing the worm-like plate armor, seemed to be out of her control. Damn it! Looking at Abord and his two subordinates, dressed as mercenaries, swaggering into the terminal, the Taylor behind them could not help but gnash her teeth in anger. The power given to him by the Lord has gone to his head. He dares to take such a risk. After arriving this afternoon, Abord seemed to have changed into a different person. His fear of the Taylor seemed to have disappeared. Not only did he force-feed the half-demon kobold controlled by the Taylor a large number of synthetic explosives, but he also ignored the Taylor's dissuasion and forced her to cooperate with him. Go and do something that will leave a deep impression on the Megalosaurus Pasha. Admittedly, the Taylor was willing to sacrifice many others in order to complete the mission issued by the Demon Lord. However, she never thought that she would one day be in the position of being sacrificed. To be honest, this feeling was really terrible. However, the Taylor had no way of disobeying the mercenaries wearing the worm-like plate armor. After all, the mercenaries were much stronger than the tiefling. She could only follow Abord's instructions and take the risk of being exposed. She mobilized many of her hidden subordinates and personally handled the various procedures for the mercenaries to enter the terminal and board the floating behemoth. Chapter 263. The type, purpose, volume, weight, and unloading location of the goods. A desert kobold in front of her was asking her questions with a pen and paper. The Taylor was a little surprised. Her previous understanding of these creatures was still stuck in terms of low-level, weak, and ignorant. But now, under the leadership of the Megalosaurus Pasha, the leader of the Dragon's Nest, the members of the Desert Kobold clan had begun to learn how to write instead of relying on their instincts to dig mines for their master. The tiefling spy was in a daze for a moment, but she immediately composed herself and answered carefully. The goods are silver-threaded silk enamel flannelette, transported from Bite to Gnome City for the transaction. It takes about 30 standard crates, and the weight has not been weighed. We will need to borrow the terminal's cargo scale to weigh it before we can give you a clear answer. Go and box it first. After weighing it, bring back the receipt to pay the fee. The Dragonborn scribe nodded and motioned for the Taylor to take them through the payment channel. At the same time, he kindly reminded the Taylor, the departure time is at most half an hourglass. You have to hurry. If you miss the flight, you will have to wait 2 days for the new floating behemoth to arrive in Bite City. The Taylor thanked the scribe humbly and quickly called Abord and the others who were disguised as her mercenaries to quickly carry the goods to the box and weigh them. Of course, the main labor was done by the two subordinates of the Desert Elf mercenary commander. Most of the time, the Taylor was admiring the floating behemoth at the top of the mooring tower. Shameful plagiarist. At this time, a storm was raging in Abord's mind, and the initiator of this storm was the real owner of the worm plate armor on his body. This floating behemoth is so similar to the sky-burning walker. It must be destroyed, the Desert Elf thought to himself. Otherwise, my mind will always be filled with irritable noise. Under the reminder of the Taylor, Obud shifted his gaze away from the floating behemoth. He brought 2 men with him to pack the high-grade velvet into a standard crate provided by the desert kobolds. They then lifted the crate to weigh the weight of the goods. 55 silver cats and 6 copper cats for the goods. The desert kobold in charge of collecting fees looked at the stamped proof of weighing the goods and did some calculations. Together with 4 people and loading and unloading fees, the total is 63 silver cats. After hearing the price, the Taylor couldn't help but feel his heart ache. However, using the scale of perpetual order for air transportation was fast and convenient, so it was indeed worth the high price. Moreover, if they were to succeed, their gains would be far greater than this. After paying the fee obediently, the tailor received the pass to board the boat. She walked up to the desert elf mercenary captain and asked in a low voice, "How confident are you? Or should I say, how many people are you prepared to sacrifice?" The tiefling female spy felt that she had to at least know the other party's bottom line before she could weigh the risk of this operation. However, she didn't know that under the influence of the worm-plate armor, Obud's heart had already been filled with madness and had no bottom line. Ignoring the question of the tailor, the desert elf only urged 2 of his men to cooperate with the members of the Dragonborn clan who came to help. They carried the goods up to the floating behemoth's cabin as soon as possible. Because the value of the goods, the silver-threaded enamel velvet, was high, and they paid a high transportation fee, the tailor and several mercenaries, together with the crates containing the goods, were all arranged on the uppermost deck. Unlike the Leviathan, these floating behemoths, which were derived from the Leviathan, were slightly smaller in size. In order to increase their cargo-carrying capacity, they were not designed with an upper cabin for people to live in. The uppermost deck, the deck closest to the control center, was also a warehouse. However, most of the time, this deck was used to store some high-value goods to prevent the goods from being lost during the voyage. In the end, no one knew what happened to the goods. When Obud, the tailor, and the others boarded the deck with the goods, they found that there were only a few caravans around. Every caravan had guards, ranging from 2 to 3 people to 8 or 9 people. They surrounded the fixed shelves where their goods were placed, either sitting or lying down. Judging from the containers on the shelves, they should be high-value goods such as jewelry and spices, but they were small in size. The crates that the desert elf and the others carried up were the only ones. No one communicated with each other, probably because the goods they carried were of relatively high value. The guards of each caravan, even if they were resting, were alert and vigilant of the surrounding movements. After waiting for a while, the bronze horns around the deck sounded, informing the floating behemoth to prepare for takeoff. The passengers and air crew in the cabin were also prepared. Then, everyone felt a gradually increasing sense of oppression in their ears. Fortunately, it was not strong. Unlike the other passengers who tried their best to squat down or simply sit on the deck, Obud twisted his neck and stood up straight. He lifted the hooded cloak, revealing the scarlet maggot plate armor wrapped inside. He began to walk toward the goods that the tailor had brought up. He opened a crate and took out 2 pieces of silver-threaded enamel flannel. He held them in both hands and shook them hard. Then he connected them neatly, and the silver lines connected instantly. "You guys should help too." Seeing the other passengers looking at him with doubtful eyes, the maggot plate armor on Obud's body swelled, and a large number of ferocious maggots rushed out in an instant. "Buy me some time, although it's better than nothing." Just like opening the floodgates, countless maggots rushed out of the maggot plate armor and pounced on the other passengers on the deck. The guard of the caravan were obviously no match for these guests from the abyss. They were quickly defeated, and several or even dozens of maggots drilled into each of their bodies. The parasitized humans immediately mutated. As they had parasitized the bodies of other Tana-Reet demons for many years, the maggots carried a large amount of demonic genetic material in their bodies. Under their influence, these human hosts had many aberrations of demonic transformation. In the pipes on the walls of the deck, dozens of messenger lizards that could record and repeat conversations memorized the voice here. Driven by instinct, they quickly passed through the pipes. They were sending messages, and, at the same time, they wanted to escape from here. At this time, Obud ordered his new subordinates to attack and destroy the cabin at will. He needed them to buy him some time to complete the few pieces of rune cloth he brought up. As long as he could complete the runes filled with demonic power, he could borrow the power of more maggot lords to suppress the consciousness of the floating behemoth. After that, Obud would let them go all the way west and deliver an unexpected gift from the sky to the Megalosaurus Pasha who had been caught in the assassination, according to the plan. Chapter 264. More than 30 standard crates of silver-threaded enamel flannelette were assembled into an enormous rune carpet that covered the entire uppermost deck of the suspension cabin of the floating behemoth. The aura of chaos and destruction flowed out of the flashing runes, spreading to every inch of the deck. Other than the mercenary and the tailor, all the humans, including the two men brought by aboard, had been infected by the acid mistworm demons and mutated into horrifying and deformed half-demonic creatures. The Dragonborn clan's aviators had long known about the anomaly inside the floating behemoth thanks to the messenger lizard's report. They wore the special aviation version of the fanatic armor, used the steam-repeating crossbow developed by the Ogre Neru, and bravely dealt with the attacking monsters. The floating behemoth, which was a derivative of the Leviathan, immediately used the antenna set up above its body to amplify and use psionic communication means to transmit the situation here. It also called for help from the headquarters of the scales of the Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce. The aviators in the dye cabin desperately threw fuel, stored syrup, and other organic matter into the biological furnace to provide for the Leviathan derivative's proliferation, creating a new type of defensive or offensive organ. Several tentacles had snaked down the chain from the floating behemoth's body and invaded the cabin wall. Some were responsible for protecting the passengers and cargo inside the lower deck, while others rushed to the upper deck and fought the mutated half-demonic creatures head-on. The Burning Sky Traveler can't do that. After the battle began, Aubert, whose body and mind had been taken over by the wormplate armor, saw the gigantic tentacles with serrated mouth parts attacking the half-demon in a frenzy. He furrowed his brows and gave a detailed assessment. But it did not take long before he relaxed and became enthusiastic again. We have to collect more flesh samples. After all, this is the future of the Burning Sky Traveler. The Leviathan derivative's attack was deadly, and the Dragonborn clan's counterattack was also very tenacious. But the half-demonic mutated creatures with sharp teeth and claws and tumor-like scales were not aboard's last resort. For the demon's servant codenamed Mercenary, they were just consumables, and their only use was to buy some time. When the last piece of rune cloth flashed, a sinister shadow began to appear in the center of the highest deck. With the command of the desert elf wearing the worm-like armor, the demonic power that had been strengthened multiple times gradually solidified and even began to boil. Spatial cracks that exuded a terrifying pressure appeared in the material plane. Despair, panic, this taste is great. The voice of the demon lord came from the crack. The tentacles that were trying to enter the cabin door on the deck seemed to have been cut by a sharp chainsaw and turned into pieces all over the ground. The remaining parts quickly retreated. Almost all the living creatures in the suspension cabin were affected. They were devoured by the acid mistworms that broke out of their bodies amidst their miserable cries. Aboard, who was wearing the worm armor, and the tiefling female, spine knelt down in fear. Great Master, ruler of the acid fog canyon plain, creator of the acid fog worms of the bottomless abyss, please listen to the request of your humble servant. The desert elf opened his hands and allowed the acid worms to crawl all over his body. Please tame this floating behemoth and let it bring death to our enemies. Let its destruction show your dark glory. With his prayer, the tyrant worm in the bottomless abyss passed through the space crack and let out an even more powerful force. The silver threads on the rune cloth, which were camouflaged to seal the evil power, all burned. The soul sealed in the rune cloth became particularly active due to the lack of restraint. The entire deck seemed to be covered with a layer of sticky and evil souls. Along with the tyrant worm's incantation, the power of the vengeful spirits was pushed to the limit. The power of resentment they gathered due to their wrongful deaths formed the most powerful curse, and its target was the Leviathan behemoth spawn that was desperately trying to sever the hangar's chains. The floating behemoth had already sensed the threat. After a simple communication with the headquarters of the Scale of Perpetual Order, it began to use the thorny tentacles that were mutated from its flagella to cut the metal and beast tendons that bound the chains. The chains that were originally used to support the weight of the floating behemoth were undoubtedly of excellent quality. In addition, the The acid worms attached to the chains used their own bodies as a barrier to resist the tentacles cutting. The combination of these two factors caused the floating behemoth's progress in saving itself to be very limited. When the curse that was as powerful as the most powerful enchantment spell hit the floating behemoth's massive body, there were still 36 safety chains that were completely intact. However, the resentment of thousands of wrongful souls easily seized control of the behemoth's body. The Dragonborn clan pilots who survived the tyrant worm's terrifying attack and were hiding in the control center of the Leviathan clone were instantly trapped in the behemoth's body. It was as if they were on an isolated island, or as if they were locked in a prison in the sky. There was no way for them to get in touch with the outside world. Go and complete your mission. The demonic power on the upper deck was almost depleted due to the casting of a powerful spell across the plane. The dimensional fissure had become very unstable. The tyrant worm hurriedly issued its final order. Find that young dragon, inflict a heavy blow on it, and summon me again. I've already lit the fire for dinner in the Abyss Kingdom. As you command, your need is my mission. The two servants of the evil demon lord rushed to express their loyalty in front of their master at the same time. The runic carpet that covered the upper deck had already faded. Taking advantage of the last moment when the rift was closing, the tyrant worm threw out 2 pink worms of acidic mist. Take one each and control the attack of the behemoth, and create the conditions for me to descend later. Before its voice died away, the space crack that connected to the acid fog canyon in the bottomless abyss suddenly collapsed, leaving only a few electric sparks to prove its existence. I'll be responsible for creating the conditions for the master's arrival, the tailor said first. She bent over and picked up a pink acid worm, which quickly turned into a portal. And you, since your nickname is Mercenary, you'll still be responsible for the fighting and killing. Looking at his companion who found the opportunity and walked into the portal without looking back, a sneer appeared on the desert elf's face. That's natural. The tailor is only fit to thread the needle, and I'm the one who's qualified to enjoy this. Knight of the Long Sword. Aboard waved his hand, and the remaining pink worm turned into another portal. The arm guard of the worm plate armor flashed red, and a long sword appeared in his hand. He walked into the portal. On the other side of the door, the control center of the Leviathan clone heard the sound of flesh being torn apart. Chapter 265. I'm so stupid, really. Lilith, who was hiding at the bottom of the suspension cabin, lamented to himself. If he was given a second chance, he would definitely kill the 2 lackeys who dare to threaten him. He would definitely refuse to escape on the floating behemoth. He would definitely think of a way to avoid those dangerous and crazy demon servants. Not long ago, the terrifying aura that erupted from the upper deck clearly revealed the stench of the bottomless abyss. It was full of destruction and chaos, and the fact that he was immersed in it was a disaster in itself. Through the life concealment spell, the black-robed mage who was revived in the clone did not dare to expose himself. He was unable to resist the powerful strength of the demon lord, and he did not want to guess what kind of perverted plan the 2 crazy demon servants would have after discovering him. In order not to be detected by them, when the power of the tyrant worm's projection descended and distorted the rules of this place, causing all the passengers to suffer the calamity of the acid mist worms breaking out of their bodies, Lilith did not even use a powerful spell to get rid of the worms in his body. Enduring the pain caused by the worms gnawing at his bones and flesh, he only used a spell that was once used to numb experimental materials to temporarily seal his sense of pain. Until all the acid mist worms were expelled from his body, he simply repaired his wounds. Then, he found a corner of a shelf and carefully hid in it, concentrating on sensing the changes in his surroundings and looking for an opportunity to use a teleportation spell to leave. From a certain point of view, he was indeed stupid to be so cautious. In fact, if Lilith made a prompt decision to leave at this time, the mercenary aboard, who was painstakingly controlling the floating behemoth, would not be able to do anything to him. And it was precisely because of his hesitation that he would encounter more troublesome problems later on. From Bite City to the lagoon, there was only a distance of about 10 parasangs in a straight line. Flying at full speed, the floating behemoth took less than 1/6 of an hourglass to reach its destination. And the time it needed to prepare for an attack in the air was even faster than the time it needed to travel. Standing above the huge body of the Leviathan, a board, who was wearing a worm plate armor, stood against the wind. The leg armor wrapped around his calf and was completely immersed in the flesh and blood of the behemoth, constantly absorbing nutrients. While strengthening himself, he also gave birth to a group of airborne troops. At this time, the floating behemoth was like a rotten apple, parasitized by the acid mist worms that looked like fruit flies. Benefiting from the rich life energy of the behemoth, the worms rapidly matured and mutated at a speed visible to the naked eye. Some of them grew chitin shells, while others grew tumor-like scales. Their round bodies tore apart, and arms with sharp claws and strong legs stretched out one after another. Around their mouth parts, which were originally used for eating, terrifying chelicerae grew out, dripping with a strong corrosive green acid. Like a trypophobia sufferer in his worst nightmare, the half-demons that grew from the metamorphosis of the acid mistworms. They were not pure demons of the lower realm who had body and soul as one. Were all crouching in the shallow pits on the surface of the Leviathan's body, waiting for their commander's command. Even if they were high up in the air, they would jump down in one fell swoop. Evacuate before the behemoth hits the ground. Holding the pink special acid mistworm in his hand, the desert elf aboard could communicate with these novice subordinates without hindrance. Flesh, blood, life, soul, fear, despair. You can do whatever you want, but remember not to leave any residue behind. After the explosion, the joyous atmosphere of the banquet in the museum was swept away. As the one who had personally experienced the scene of the explosion, the dragon Pachakis was even more surrounded by the assembled Naroya guards, leaving no room for escape. This is the demon's handiwork. Quest did not explain anything in the face of the guards who appeared as if they were facing a great enemy. Instead, he calmly told the Grand Vader who had teleported over, "They should still have a backup plan. One of my floating behemoths has been hijacked." A moment ago, the headquarters of the Scales of Eternal Order sent the latest news through the radio. Although Keyes did not know the other party's specific plan, before the assassin self-destructed, he shouted, "Art is an explosion," which gave Keyes a rough guess. It was most likely an old acquaintance. The young Blue Dragon's guess was very accurate, but he could not understand why the Tyrant Worm, who was being attacked by the Bator Expeditionary Army and the Evil Dragon Court, would have the leisure to spend so much energy to take revenge on him. Although he knew that with the Demon Lord's means, as long as he was willing to put in the effort, he would most likely be able to find him. According to the Dragon Queen's temperament, if the Tyrant Worm dared to touch the clergy field related to the Megalosaurus, she would naturally fight to the death. Since Keyes landed in the Acid Fog Canyon and connected it to Bator, there were legendary Penishade dragons washing the ground with dragon flames every day. It could be said that if not for the fact that the acid fogworm was good at digging holes and hiding, it would have long been extinct. Although most of the demon's actions were chaotic, it was a matter of life and death. With the wisdom of a demon lord, he should be able to distinguish the priorities. If he's in a hurry to take revenge, it must be related to the crisis he's facing now. After changing his way of thinking, Keyes' thoughts gradually became clearer. If he wants to solve the crisis, he must win a partial bloody battle. There are only two ways: either strengthen himself or find allies. The latter speculation had nothing to do with the Tyrant Worm descending to the material plane. In other words, his act of vengeance could strengthen his own power. He is seeking to be apatheicized. Among the priesthoods he covets, besides dragon, it may also include revenge and revenge. Suddenly, Quest caught on to the main point and cleared his thoughts. His act of vengeance against me is to fulfill his priesthoods and strengthen the Tyrant Worm's power. Thinking of this, the young blue dragon's uneasiness eased. Although he still could not let his guard down, at least he had figured out the other party's needs and could make targeted arrangements according to his needs. He would not be led by the nose all the time. Revenge is his core need. Then, while Quest was pondering, he suddenly felt a faint wave of psionic energy coming from the sky above his head. Combined with the information he received from the scales of eternal order, he immediately realized where the next attack would come from. The Grand Vader. He did not say anything. He believed that the Grand Vader, as the strongest spellcaster and medic, must have his own means to discover the abnormal situation above his head. Chapter 266. Fortune is accompanied by misfortune, and misfortune is accompanied by fortune. This is a pattern that I've concluded after many years of business operations. In the early days of the scale of perpetual order, business was booming and flourishing. But who would have thought that in the capital of the United States of America, there would be an unexpected loss, and business would even come to a standstill? And all of this was due to that frightening night of the long blades. Santos Ben Joser's message to his descendants, written by Santos, the founder of the Sand Rhino family and an early member of the scale of perpetual order. 2 flowers bloomed, one on each side. Apart from the Desert Elf mercenary group leader who wanted to severely injure Keys, there was also a demon servant, a female tiefling spy codenamed Taylor, who was busy with her own work. She walked out of the teleportation portal and directly returned to Kanawha Street in the southwest district of Bite City. She appeared in her colorful tent. The moment her feet touched the ground, she walked towards the corner of the tent. There was a huge treasure chest there. From the outside, this treasure chest seemed to be made of oak with ironclad corners. It also had 4 strong legs that resembled lion claws. 2 strong companions had expended a tremendous amount of effort to bring this treasure chest here. However, just like Oberd, the female tiefling spy didn't have the time to look for stronger companions, especially when she was about to carry out a secret mission. Come here. The low cupboard began to glow. The 2 metal legs of the cupboard began to move as the lion claws stretched out. The cupboard began to move forward. This heavy cupboard walked towards Taylor in its own unique way. It looked just like a hunting dog that Taylor had summoned. Finally, a few inches from its mistress, it stopped and waited for a new command. Open. With a long creak, the cupboard door opened. Taylor turned around in satisfaction and reached out towards the numerous items hanging from her. A small piece of something automatically fell down and landed in her waiting palm. The female tiefling spy, who was half a spellcaster, stuffed it into the cupboard and then moved on to the next item. One by one, Taylor placed a pile of items into the cupboard. If someone was watching from the side, they would realize that no matter how many things were placed in the cupboard would never be full. This seamstress was always able to find enough space, and there was no exception every time. Just as the work was coming to an end, the tailor suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. She immediately turned around. After searching for a while, she finally found a shadow standing beside her. Hey, you're finally back. Where have you been? The half-demon dog-headed man did not answer at first. Its shadow was almost completely hidden in the folds of the tent. After using Sacrificial Strike in the Museum of the Grand Dimensional in the lagoon, it still had lingering fears. The explosion instantly destroyed the assassin's body, but it also blew away the smoke crystal powder on his body. This allowed him to use his special skill at the last moment, temporarily transforming into a shadow creature and using the shadow reconstruction ability to escape with his life. Tell me, where did that mercenary go? You promised me. To the tailor's surprise, the resurrected half-demon dog-headed man actually became more eloquent. It was as if he was a completely different person from the silent assassin that the demon lord had originally rewarded him with. But this was exactly what she wanted. After all, the tailor had long since wanted to kill that desert elf. He's currently launching a second attack on the museum. Taylor carefully walked to the candlestick in the middle of the tent so that there wouldn't be too many shadows around her. I'll fulfill my promise, but not now. Master has arranged a new mission for you and me. After putting the last item into the cupboard, the tailor reached out and wiped the cupboard that had been activated. The cupboard instantly locked and gradually shrunk to the size of a dressing box, which was held in its owner's hands. "I'll be responsible for creating panic." The tiefling spy recited a long incantation. The tent she was in suddenly collapsed and transformed into numerous worms. Under the cover of the night, the worms wriggled towards the corners of the streets. "And you'll only be responsible for killing." After the museum's guests were checked, they hurried back to bite from the lagoon area one by one. This great city was still immersed in the aftertaste of Opat Festival. Many city residents who had just gotten rid of their hangovers once again walked out of their homes to continue the debauchery that they hadn't had the chance to enjoy yesterday. The circus troupe on the streets of Kiniwo was no longer as quiet as it usually was during the day. Instead, it was working hard to put on a variety of nighttime performances. The owner of the Old Mirror Tavern had already asked his employees to stock up on a considerable amount of alcohol. Now all of it came in handy. In fact, the amount was still insufficient, so he had to secretly add some water to the wine barrel. Nobody should care. They won't notice anyway. Besides, the Old Mirror doesn't need new furniture. Looking at the customers in the tavern's main hall shouting and yelling, the tavern owner instructed his employees to keep their eyes open. If there was a sign that touching would turn into fighting, he must call the newly hired guards to solve the problem. It's not cheap to hire these people, the tavern owner secretly thought to himself. He picked up the account book, made of papyrus, and looked at it for a while. Since he had nothing to do, he found a rag and began to wipe the various decorations on the bar counter. When he wiped a skull candle holder bought from a vendor in the archipelago, he inexplicably felt a little uncomfortable. The skull seemed to have a twisted smile, as if it was cheerfully inviting him to join its ranks forever. What an unlucky thing. At this moment, he seemed to have forgotten how eager he was to take out his money pouch when he heard the peddler say that this rather strange ornament could bring him fortune. "I'll return at dawn. If that profiteer dares to stab me, I'll find someone to beat him up." Just when he was considering whether he should ask the profiteer for more compensation for the mental damage, a disgusting worm suddenly protruded from the eye sockets of the skull, giving the tavern owner quite a fright. What the hell? It was the same word that the tavern owner had in mind, but it did not come out of his mouth. A drinker who saw the tavern owner's showdown first roared, then took a big gulp of lager and smashed the oak cup on his opponent's head. The painful cry of a broken head and the scuffle after the table was flipped seamlessly intertwined. Chaos and violence quickly spread from one point to the other, quickly spreading to the entire tavern. Not long after, the tavern's waiters and guards were all wrapped in the chaos. At first, it was just fists, soles of shoes, and tables and chairs flying. Later, someone took out a knife first, and the situation suddenly became out of control. Everyone wanted to protect themselves, but in fact, they were all launching indiscriminate attacks on others. Terrified, the owner of the tavern tried to escape with an agility that did not match his fat body. However, he accidentally knocked the skull candlestick to the ground, and the wax dripped onto the worm that was squeezed into a pile of mud by the skull and the ground, burning fiercely. In an instant, the entire tavern was set ablaze, and the flames and panic began to spread at the same time. After withstanding a few punches and kicks that came from nowhere and dodging a beer barrel that was thrown from nowhere, the tavern owner quickly ran to the street, wanting to seek help from others. But the scene on the street made him even more terrified. The entire Keniwo street had been infected with violent emotions. It seemed that everyone had the impulse to commit violence against the people around them, and carried out this desire without any scruples. What the hell? With his body, which was half a foot wider than a door, he knocked away a pedestrian who tried to attack him, and then restrained the thought of stabbing the kitchen knife in his hand into the other person's throat. I have to find a safe place. The question of where was safe did not bother him for long. As the cousin of Santos, the big boss of the Sand Rhino Caravan and the senior manager of the Scale of Perpetual Order, he decided to flee to the terminal near the southern wall of Bite City to seek shelter at the first opportunity. With his shrewdness, it was not difficult for him to guess that there must be a mastermind behind this sudden disaster. And as a commoner, the best way to face a disaster was to quickly rely on the strong. As for how to stop this disaster, it was a problem that the aristocrats of Bite City and even Pharaoh had to consider. At the very least, the Imperial Guards would be dispatched to suppress the riot. The only choice he could make now was to not cause trouble for them. Although the street was in chaos, the tavern owner had lived in Bite City for more than 10 years and was very familiar with almost every alley here. In addition, Keniwo Street was not far from the southern wall, so it only took him about a quarter of an hourglass to reach the gate of the terminal. Halt! After receiving the news that the floating behemoth was hijacked, all the guards of the terminal entered the highest state of alert. They put on their armor, picked up their weapons, and set up layers of isolation zones near the terminal. Phew! It's me. The tavern owner panted heavily because of the fierce running and showed the official seal given to him by his cousin. I'm a relative of Santos of the Sand Rhino Caravan. I'm here to seek shelter. As he spoke, he gestured to the guards and pointed behind him. Many mobs with bloodthirsty eyes were holding all kinds of weapons and rushing toward the terminal aggressively. Archers, take your positions and line up in 3 echelons. The captain in charge of commanding the guards of the terminal pulled Santos' cousin behind him and asked his deputy to check the official seal again. He hurriedly issued his order. The first wave of test fire is warning. The second wave, changed to blunt weapons, reduce the damage, and focus on stun. A figure appeared beside the guard captain, startling everyone. More than a dozen crossbow bolts locked onto the target at the same time. Fortunately, the guard captain recognized the newcomer. Mr. One-Eyed, what instructions does Lord Pasha have? Chapter 267. At the beginning of the explosion in the Grand Dimensional Museum, Keys had used magic to send a message to the 2 brothers, One-Eye and Crooked Mouth, who were guarding the carriages outside the lagoon, to immediately reinforce the terminal in Bite City. The subsequent hijacking incident made the young Blue Dragon even more convinced that something big would happen in the capital of Medic. With the intelligence of the Tyrant Worm, he must know that if he wanted to seek revenge, he must find a way to temporarily descend into the Ashen World. Even if he used a clone to descend into the material world, the Demon Lord would have to pay a high price. With the current situation in the Acid Fog Canyon, he might not be able to afford it. Therefore, he must seek some help to reduce the consumption required for his descent. The lives, blood, flesh, and souls of innocent people were all excellent offerings to the head of the evil demons. In this way, Key's logic became clear. Bite, the city with the largest population in Medic, would most likely be attacked by the Demon Lord tonight. And the target was most likely the air transportation industry related to the young Blue Dragon. The use of blunt weapons is a special request of Lord Pasha. One-Eye quickly explained to the puzzled guards. The reason why we don't use weapons with sharp edges is because we are worried that the dead people will encourage the enemy's conspiracy. He pointed to the mobs coming from afar. Besides, to deal with such a motley crew, it's not more difficult to knock them out than to kill them all. Archers, get ready. Concentrate your firepower. Go up 3 notches and shoot the arrows. The captain of the guards, who roughly understood One-Eye's words, immediately ordered. These guards, composed of the warriors of the Dragonborn clan and the elite mercenaries recruited from all over the world, were all well trained. They were especially decisive and swift when executing orders. They first inserted the arrows into the oil cylinders hanging on the side of their bodies, stirred a little, and let the black oil mixed with resin powder fully soak the arrowheads. Then they drew the bows, lit the arrowheads, and shot them together according to the captain's command. The sharp sound of arrows piercing through the air rang out one after another. At this time, even the fiercest storm could not suppress their sound. The rain of death poured down, but did not fall on the enemy. The first arrow fell to the ground, and some others missed, but still hit the target. The flames quickly spread, and a wall of fire was built between the rioters and the terminal. However, what was surprising was that the citizens who were filled with violent emotions seemed to have become fearless. They ignored the warning in front of them and began to use their clothes to put out the flames. Some of them even endured the pain of being burned and forced their way through the wall of fire. Teams 2 and 3 advance and attack. With the command of the guard captain, the well-prepared terminal guards lined up and walked out. They formed groups of 3 and held long spears and sharp swords that were wrapped in linen cloth. They knocked down every mob that crossed the wall of fire and knocked them unconscious. The other guards took out many ropes and were responsible for tying up the unconscious people and dragging them to the side to detain them. Fortunately, in order to secure the floating behemoth, there were plenty of ropes in the terminal building. Otherwise, there would be no way to effectively guard so many captives. One-Eyed walked to one of the rioters whose limbs were tied behind his back and lifted him up with one arm. He reached out and pulled open the rioter's eyelids, only to find that the rioter's pupils were dilated and there were more white eyes than black eyeballs. Except for the slight trace of brain concussion, the rioter was not very clear-headed. This former bandit leader was now an illusionary magician under the command of Megalosaurus Pasha. He was experienced and knowledgeable. However, after thinking for a long time, he still could not figure out a good way to relieve this rage symptom. It's just as His Excellency Pasha said. He put down the captive in his hand and casually cast an illusionary spell, doubling the number of guards in the eyes of the rioters. The riot in Bite City was caused by the servants of the demons in some way. Different from the orderly defense and quick control of the situation in the terminal building, the violent riot in Kaniwo Street soon spread to the entire southwest district of Bite City and even to the other central districts and the adjacent southeast district. However, the central district was guarded by the Pharaoh's imperial guards, while the southeast district was the residential area of the nobles and rich merchants. The guards in charge of guarding the houses were also quite capable. When the rioters swarmed in, they formed a breakwater. Hiding herself, the tiefling female spy used the semi-finished acid mistworms that she hatched to spread the special product from the abyss, honey obtained from the nest of the demon bees. She also refined the honey into an extract. The devil bee was a kind of insect-like creature with long fangs and horns. It was about the size of a dog. It was used to flapping its translucent red wings and flying towards its prey. It bared its fangs like a wolf and stretched out its humanoid claws with disturbing claws. The demon bees existed in groups. They were divided into 2 groups, the wasps and the queen wasps. They were first discovered in the abyss, and now they had spread all over the lower plains. Because of their aggressive and bloodthirsty members, the demonic bee swarm threatened all the creatures they encountered. According to some mages who had studied the demon bees in the past, if the demon bees were allowed to continue migrating with their uncontrollable rage, they might even spread to all the mortal planes. Apart from the queen wasps, which are capable of producing antagonistic genes, the other wasps were unable to consume the demon bees' honey, even though they were capable of secreting the demon bees' honey. That was because the demon bees' honey would be affected and become even crazier. It was easy to imagine just how terrifying the demon bees' honey was. It was no wonder that the extract from the demon bees' honey was able to cause such a huge commotion in Bite City. All of you, stop right there. Anyone who incites chaos shall be killed without question. The commander of the Imperial Guards unhesitatingly gave his order when he saw the rioters swarming towards them. Not long ago, the Imperial Guards had received orders to defend the outskirts of the Central District. They were in charge of protecting the Central District of the Medici Empire from being attacked. In order to increase the Imperial Guards' morale, a row of knights riding on 6-legged horses stepped out and stood in front of the Imperial Guards. The sharp spears in their hands were pointed diagonally at the ground. It seemed that they were ready to charge at any moment in order to get their fill of blood. Of course, the Imperial Guards were only pretending to be arrogant in order to scare the rioters. They weren't actually going to start a massacre. After all, this was Bite City, the most glorious capital city of Medici. These people had sworn to protect this city. Chapter 268. Similar to the situation near the border of the central city, the situation was also happening at the junction between the southeast and southwest districts of Bite. There, the guards of the nobles and merchants of Bite were also trying their best to resist the rioters who were poisoned by the demonic honey extract. They need some help. Hiding in the shadows and observing the situation, the tailor emptied the copper pot in her hand. The last drop of the demonic honey extract dispersed into the air. If you want to do something well, sometimes you have to do it yourself. She raised her beloved purgatory fawn. Ironically, as the servant of the demon lord, the tiefling spy's weapon had a Bateau-style name. However, this did not affect the quality of the weapon. With the help of a spell, the delicate enchanted crossbow locked on to the target. With a gentle pull of the trigger, the arrow in the firing slot was shot out silently by the well-tempered steel string. The vicious arrow pierced through the victim's eye and easily took the life of a nobleman's guard captain. At the same time, the flag with the pattern of viper and bush was stained with a lot of red and white, which looked quite disgusting. Captain. The guard standing next to the dead captain was stunned at first. Then, he flew into a rage. He shouted at the others in a hoarse voice, "Those rioters are carrying prohibited weapons. Kill them, in the name of Eternal Blaze." It was somewhat confusing to shout Eternal Blaze in the dark night. However, the guards who heard the shout chose to follow the advice. After all, the arrow and the dead captain's eye could not be taken lightly. They all drew their weapons. Kill them. No one knew who shouted the slogan first. The angry rioters and the guards of the nobles and merchants attacked each other from the opposite side of the street at the same time. Spittle from their mouths splattered on each other's faces as the two groups of people clashed. When hot-bloodedness became cheap, humans' fear of death also became insignificant. A sickle-edged sword would cut through the skin and flesh, and a dagger would stab into the shoulder blade. A slap to the cheek would likely result in a heavy kick to the groin. Bleeding and serious injuries would bring fear, but this fear would soon be replaced by hatred. To be fair, compared to the hired guards who had received a certain degree of training and had even fought for years, the rioters had definitely bled more. Coupled with the difference in weapons and armor, even if they were in a state of uncontrollable rage, the citizens of the city still fell into pools of blood like wheat in the fields during harvest season. These idiots. After returning from the lagoon, the president of the Obsidian Council, Kanini, had been paying close attention to the situation in Bite City. Although he didn't care about the lives of mortals as a demon count, he couldn't ignore the presence of demons in Medici's capital, whether it was for public or private reasons. In his plan, everything in Bite City belonged to him. One day, he would be able to drag the Ashes plane into the 9 prisons of Bader. He would also be able to get rid of the awkward position of a demon count and obtain a brand new promotion path. How could he not be anxious? When any Batsu was making a plan, if a demon appeared in the plan, no matter how confident he was in his intelligence, he would try his best to eliminate this variable. Because if they were intelligent enough, they would certainly not try to guess what the chaotic demons were up to, let alone find a way to take advantage of the demons' innate uncertainty. If they were not capable enough to eliminate the influence of the demons, the Batsa Devil would decisively choose to give up. But Kanini couldn't give up at all. Therefore, even if he sensed that the cause of this disturbance might be a demon lord from a certain level of the abyss, he still had to bite the bullet and find a way to deal with the other party. We have to stop the spread of chaos. The quick-witted demon Count immediately thought of the key to breaking the situation. With the knowledge in his mind, he realized that the other party might want to send an avatar to descend, so he sent people to cause the chaos in Bite City. Blood sacrifice, soul sacrifice, panic, chaotic atmosphere. Damn it, now there are too many materials for the other party to choose from. Like the initiator of this chaos, Kanini was also hiding in the shadows of the city. While analyzing the situation, he telegraphed to every member of the Obsidian Council through magic. Restrain your guards. Use blunt weapons when dealing with the rioters. Just knock them out. At the same time, he was also trying to find the traces of the person who caused the chaos. Nothing could happen out of thin air. Even with the power of a demon lord, It was impossible to affect mortals in the material plane without the help of any medium. And this medium could be some kind of demonic creation, or it could be some kind of magic ritual. But the most likely possibility was that the demon's servants were playing tricks. One had to admit that the ones who knew the demons the best were always the demons. Instead of trying to get rid of the demon once and for all, it's better to find those servants who are loyal to him first. First, it's easier. Second, it's enough to temporarily disrupt the descend plan of that abyss bastard. Kanini, the demon count, quickly came to his senses. After all, if traces of the demon appear, I'm not the only one who should have headache. After figuring this out, he began to take action. His body swayed slightly, and several identical figures appeared behind him. Taking advantage of the cover of the night, they fled into the darkness. These clones created by magic left quickly and sneaked into the streets and alleys of Bite City. First, they searched the areas where the rioters gathered. They either directly knocked them out or used group hypnosis spell to drag many citizens into the depths of the streets and alleys. Then, they used the demon's special skill and directly began to interrogate the souls of these unlucky people, supporting so many clones and at the same time reading the soul images sent back by them. Even with the power of a demon count, Kanini felt his body and mind begin to become exhausted. However, as the saying went, effort always pays off. Coupled with the fact that his efforts were directed in the right direction, Kanini only needed to persevere for a short while before he noticed something. Among the more than 120 samples of the rioters, the same figure appeared in the soul images of more than a dozen of them. Although they might not have noticed anything, it was enough to make Batsu suspicious. So, it's her. After dissecting the last sample, Kanini finally saw a soul image that recorded the side profile of the suspect. He instantly recognized the identity of the suspect and was therefore enraged. New grudges and old scores. I'll settle them all today. Chapter 269. The tailor dodged the mobs that were either gathering or fighting with each other. She vigilantly scanned the towering observation tower in the distance, which was shrouded in the darkness of the night. Anyone who stood there could easily overlook the streets near the central city. She hoped that she could avoid the watchful eyes of the sharpshooters. Due to the riot at night, almost all of the best soldiers of the Imperial Guards had been mobilized. They occupied all the high points in the city. On one hand, they could monitor the spread of the riot. On the other hand, they wanted to search for clues to find the source of the chaos. Clinging to the wall, the tiefling spy carefully made her preparations. She was not as agile as the half-demon kobolds, and the closer she was to the central city, the higher the chance of being discovered if she used magic. Therefore, she had to use some tools to help her climb. After fastening the belt that contained the Inferno Fong, the tailor began to climb up. The wall was completely made of stone and did not have many supporting points. Even though she had tied iron claws to the soles of her shoes, it was still quite difficult for her to climb up. After climbing to a height of about 30 centimeters, some traces of decay appeared on the marble. The taller the building, the more affected it would be by the sandstorms of Medici. Leaves of drunken fish grass poked out from between the cracks of the stone, making it easier for the tailor to find a gap to stand on. The tiefling's spy cautiously looked over the edge of the battlements. There were 2 archers on the left side of the defensive wall. They had their backs to her, and their bodies were leaning forward with bows in their hands. The tailor did not hesitate. She quickly focused and stared at the dark area. Then she took out her Inferno Fong and fired 2 arrows in succession with amazing accuracy. The first arrow pierced the back of one of the archer's neck. The archer fell down on the battlements without making a sound. The second arrow was slightly slower to hit the target, but it carried a lot of force and sank into the back of the second archer. The archer let out a muffled cry and fell into the dark alley below. Below the tailor, at the top of a long stone staircase, was the door of the palace where the supreme ruler of the Medici Empire, Pharaoh, lived. However, she was glad that because of the chaos the Imperial Guards did not have enough soldiers to guard every gate. There was not a single soldier on the inner side of the gate. As long as this gate is opened, it basically means the completion of this mission. The tailor walked down the stairs 3 steps at a time, as if he was flying. Soon, he found a lever that could control the heavy iron latch. As long as he opened the latch, the iron oak gate, which was nearly 20 wrists high, would open. Even if the rioters can't get in, this will escalate the conflict. The tailor stood on her tiptoes and used her body weight to pull the lever. This device wasn't designed to be operated by a single person. If it wasn't for her half-purgatory bloodline, it would have been impossible for her to pull the lever alone. It seems that you need some help. A voice suddenly sounded behind the female tiefling spy. This voice sent a chill down her spine and forced her to give up on moving the lever. It's all right, we're just helping each other out. But I need you to help me with something first. The tailor twisted her body and placed her hand on her waist. While shooting an arrow, she made a gesture with her right hand and released a fireball. At this moment, she could no longer care about the possibility of attracting the black-robed mages stationed in Pharaoh's palace by using magic. Since the enemy could silently sneak up behind her, it was entirely possible that he could easily kill her. However, how could a demon count be so easy to deal with? Kanini caught the arrow in midair, and before the fireball could leave the tiefling's palm, it was hit by a dispel magic and turned into sparks that scattered into the air. Kanini's face emerged from the shadows. His crimson eyes were particularly eye-catching in the dark night. The tailor couldn't help but shudder. She recognized the identity of the great demon. The female tiefling spy who had once lurked in Bader's outpost naturally knew who her boss was. However, she didn't know that this great demon had a hidden identity in Bite City. My lord, the tailor pretended to be pale, trying to buy some time. A bone dagger appeared in her hand. She didn't intend to use it to block Kanini. Instead, she viciously stabbed it at herself. For the glory of the Lord, respond to my summons. This bone dagger was called Bloodcoin. It was 1 foot long and 3 inches long. Its entire body was made from the claws of a Glabrese demon. The edge of the dagger was covered with abyssal magic iron from the molten iron lake in the 10,000 abyss plains. Not only was it a sharp weapon for self-defense, but it was also a ceremonial dagger that had been enchanted with many magic effects. Tonight's chaos in Bite City was mainly used for the descent of the demon lord's incarnation. The tailor purposely collected most of the remaining scraps and stored them in this enchanted dagger. Dipping the dagger in blood as a sacrifice and using the demon imprint bestowed upon her by the tyrant worm as proof, the tailor could even use it to directly summon the descendants of the demon lord of the acid fog canyon as her temporary helpers. We're called the Calamities because we commit all kinds of evil. Ha ha. We're called the Swarm because there are so many of us. Ha ha. We're the Swarm of Calamities, and we love to bully the weak. Ha ha ha. In the ears of mortals, this was nothing more than an ordinary rustling sound that disturbed one's mind. However, as the Devil Duke, Kanini understood the meaning of the abyssal language spoken by the monster in front of him with a strange accent. He couldn't help but spit, and his highly toxic saliva corroded the stone floor into a shallow pit. The freaks born from the bottomless abyss always refresh my understanding of lowly demons. Kanini glanced sideways at the tiefling trader who was trying to stop his bleeding. It seems that your master is probably similar to this lump of worms. Before the Devil Duke even finished speaking, he suddenly activated a force field cage that instantly trapped the swarm of calamities that had just appeared. Then 2 or 3 light blue fireballs that were obviously extremely hot entered the cage, and an extremely violent explosion occurred instantly. The swarm of calamities that the tailor had placed high hopes on didn't die as soon as they appeared. Countless acid fogworms struggled out of the flames and madly gnawed at the barrier of the force field cage to find a way out for themselves. Kill him. He has the stench of a demon on him. Kill this damned demon and let him know how powerful we are. The swarm of calamities that had crawled out of the force field cage and were mostly burned to ashes started clamoring again. As they clamored, their bodies began to swell like a beating heart, and light green acid fog was constantly discharged from their bodies. Chapter 270. Chaos Aura. The faintly discernible sense of discomfort caused Kanini to notice that something was amiss. He immediately understood what this swarm of cataclysmic insects was trying to do. His expression revealed a hint of anger, but it wasn't to the point where he couldn't restrain his anger. Lowly Tana-Ri, despicable demon bastards. Even if you're only alive, you're still polluting the air. Kanini sensed the magical fluctuations nearby. It was most likely the black-robed mages stationed in Pharaoh's palace, using a teleportation spell. He didn't want to waste any more time, and took a step forward. It was as if he had teleported. This devil count used a spell-like ability to suddenly appear next to the summoner of the Calamity Bugs, the traitor of Outpost Bartho, and the female tiefling spy codenamed Taylor. Kanini's hand, which had become as hot as iron due to the high temperature, viciously grabbed the traitor's neck. The traitor's skin and flesh were instantly scorched, and there was a hissing sound. The devil count's sharp fingernails pierced into the Taylor's neck and cut through her spine, the first vertebra between the head and the back. The female tiefling spy didn't even have time to scream before death suddenly descended upon her. Her body involuntarily convulsed and tightened. Kanini grabbed her and placed a finger on the main artery in her neck, confirming that he had completed the kill. For a greater devil with solid, basic skills, as long as an ordinary being died by his hand, their soul would be unable to escape. As for interrogating souls, that was even easier. It wouldn't take him too much effort. Good luck facing the angry calamity swarm. Kanini mocked them with a smile. And before he left, he didn't forget to cast an anti-chaos curse on this guest from the Acid Fog Canyon Plain, as well as an exploding fireball that even advanced Devil Bartho liked to use. I'm sorry. You're too ugly, so I couldn't help myself. The Calamity Bugs were caught off guard. They first inexplicably felt the Ash world rejecting them. Then, the tens of thousands of Calamity Bugs that made up their bodies were once again baptized by flames. Several colorful doors appeared in the empty space behind the palace gate. Kanini recognized some familiar auras from the magical fluctuations emitted by the teleportation doors. He recognized the black-robed mages. After all, they were also members of the Obsidian Council. The others don't have as good a temper as I do. Tana-Ri, before he could finish the word scum, a short but agile figure suddenly jumped out of the Devil Count's shadow. Sharp claws with anti-magic properties instantly tore through the enchanted robe Kanini was wearing on his body. Monster Hold and Karistan Zest tentacles. These two consecutive counterattack spells. Kanini's Tuzes was of him. Of Kanini was of's. And was. Of course, was of's. A devil, but of's twos was of his of him. That to the kill to us of's s of that. Hey! But the greater devil was still powerful. The devil kobold's sharp claws only scratched the devil count's skin. Although the claws were smeared with lethal poison, Kanini only felt a little dizzy due to the devil count's physique. Kanini didn't have time to say anything. He saw that his terrifying counterattack spell had missed. The assassin who jumped out of the shadows had missed, and then disappeared back into the shadows. The surrounding teleportation doors were now stabilizing. Left with no choice, the rather exasperated devil count could only angrily stomp his feet. He took his spoils of war, the corpse of the tiefling spy, and used a high-level teleportation to leave this place. The Calamity Bugs that had been left to the side had just escaped the burning of the hellfire. They wanted to attack the greater devil count, who had been heavily injured, but they were immediately focused on by the black-robed mages who walked out of the teleportation doors. Dalamar's lightning javelin, petrification ray, Melf's acid arrow, a series of offensive spells, along with the occasional dimensional interference spell cast by the black-robed mages, who were familiar with the teleportation abilities of the lower realms. Not long after the Calamity Bugs arrived in the Ash World, this greater devil count native to the Acid Fog Canyon was tormented before he even had a chance to show off. No matter what method he used to escape this predicament, there would always be one or even more spells waiting for him. There was no way for him to escape. In the end, the Calamity Bugs struggled for about half an hourglass before the black-robed mages finally blasted the Calamity Bugs to smithereens at the cost of razing everything within 100 yards of the Pharaoh's palace to the ground. They drove the greater devil count from the material plane back to the depths of the abyss. Admittedly, the Calamity Bugs that had become the scapegoat were a little pitiful, but compared to the pot maker, named by the demon lord himself, their suffering was actually nothing. In the sky above Bite City's West Lagoon Lake, Lilith, who was in a state of weightlessness due to the floating behemoth's rapid dive, spent a lot of effort to grab a shelf nailed to the deck and stabilize his body. The spells that had once been engraved in his mind seemed to have been stolen by thieves at this time. No matter how hard he tried, he could not find any trace of them. The black-robed mages had always been proud of their magic attainments, which made them feel that they were nobler than the other nobles. Now, they might not even be as practical as having a strong arm. Fortunately, this clone body had just been activated today, and before this, Lilith had spent a lot of resources and materials to cultivate it. Therefore, even if it was a little difficult to support his body with one hand, he could still hold on for a dozen more breaths without giving up. At most, a dozen breaths of time. The black-robed mage was still clear-headed and understood the current situation. At the same time, he also had an estimate of the countdown to the floating behemoth's crash landing. The teleportation spell is too complicated. The petrification and demonic body can't withstand the impact. It must be simple and practical, and at the same time, I have to ensure that I have the strength to defend myself after landing. Lilith forced himself to concentrate and ignore the cargo that was flying everywhere in the cabin that could hit him at any time. His brain worked quickly, and finally, he recalled an effective spell. Vaporized Body. The Leviathan clone controlled by the demon's servant aboard began to disintegrate from the head due to the violent impact. The bones in the body used to support the body burst one after another. Some directly pierced through the flesh and broke out of the body. Some turned into debris and deeply embedded in the flesh. The suspension cabin hanging under the floating behemoth's body naturally had no reason to survive. Even without directly touching the ground, the shock wave caused by the violent impact of the floating behemoth's head was transmitted and destroyed the structure made of metal and wood. Lilith, whose body had turned into a translucent mass of air, was directly thrown out by the shock wave. However, due to the change in the composition of his body, he did not suffer too much damage and was not in a state of dizziness for long. The potsmith was really lucky for once. Chapter 271. Aubert, whose upper body had been sticking out of the floating behemoth's body, saw with his own eyes that in the museum, which was the target of the collision, a figure leaped into the air. The other party seemed to have chanted a spell, and more than half of his plan was ruined. Originally, he thought that the Megalosaurus Pasha, whom the tyrant worm was obsessed with, would definitely be severely injured or even destroyed by the suicidal attack of the Leviathan derivative. But at the last moment, the point of impact deviated from the target by thousands of miles. It was far away from the lagoon, and even from the golden ship that Pharaoh had come on, which had yet to raise its anchor, there was a distance of 2 to 3 pale sands. Other than the floating behemoth itself being seriously damaged, the other things were only splashing up a few rows of waves and overturning some small boats. Attack! Destroy everything there! The worm plate armor on his body flashed red, and a magic sword condensed in his hand. Aubert stood on a floating piece of minced meat of the floating behemoth. He pointed at the brightly lit museum in the lagoon in the distance and angrily gave orders to his subordinates. Although the scene that had just happened really made him feel awe and reverence for Medicus and the Great Dimensional, who were famous in the world of ashes. But the fear of the demon lord, or the fear of the possible punishment if he failed the mission, still made him choose to stake everything on this one throw. Not long ago, the half-demon creatures that had undergone the metamorphosis of the acid mistworms had undergone the baptism of the violent impact. Some of them, like the Leviathan derivative that provided them with nutrients, were torn apart. However, in the end, they were creatures with evil demon lineage, and most of them still survived. Following Aubert's order, these monsters with chitin shells on their chests and backs and sharp chelicerae on their lower bodies, like water demons, tapped lightly on the surface of the water and quickly walked on the waves. Can't these monsters run a little faster? Turning himself into a gaseous state, the former noble mage and now defector mage, Liliot, as the only remaining passenger, quickly floated high into the sky after the impact of the impact disappeared, waiting for an opportunity to move. With his greatest patience, he waited for the half-demons to rush into the lagoon lake and wreak havoc. He waited for the Grand Vader and the Megalosaurus Pasha to be overwhelmed. He waited for the moment when he could use a teleportation spell to escape. "Why don't you help those monsters?" It sounded like Lilith's own voice, but it was not. The voice that made Lilith's hair stand on end clearly came from behind him. Let me help you." Ever since he obtained the inheritance of the Power Dragon, Keyes' ability to hide his tracks had improved greatly. Before Lilith could react, a palm wrapped in thunderbolts reached out from nothingness and firmly grasped a shoulder blade that had turned into gas. Accompanied by crackling sounds, Lillard's vaporized body began to show signs of collapsing as he suffered more damage than he would in his physical state. As a last resort, he was forced to remove the spell he had cast. "So it's you. You were mummified together with that salted fish." As his scab was exposed, Lilith became furious. But he only struggled for a moment, and the young blue dragon who had transformed into a human form increased the strength of his grip. His fingers broke through the skin and flesh and reached the bone. The noble mage, who had just revived not long ago and was still tender, almost fainted from the pain. "The mage of the Obsidian Council, Mr. Lilith. I want to remind you that your president is going around the world looking for you. The Grand Vader and Pharaoh are also very interested in you. It's actually your fortune to be caught by me." Hearing this, the former member of the Obsidian Council suddenly changed his expression. But after all, he was still a spellcaster, and his IQ had always been online. "Yes," Lilith roared, but because his voice was too hoarse, it did not sound very threatening. "But then, if I fall into the hands of Kanini or the Grand Vader, no one can tell you a secret. A secret about betrayal, lies, and the power to change the world." Keyes had to admit that in order to survive, Lilith had released this important piece of news that had piqued his curiosity. Carefully observing Lilith's expression, he did not seem to be faking it. There was a moment of silence. The young blue dragon glanced at his feet. The group of half-demon monsters had already begun to enter the lagoon. On the sandbar at the periphery, the day watchmen were on standby. They were prepared to do their best to snipe them for a while to buy some time for the pickaxe fire dwarves who were somewhat afraid of the sea and were building defensive fortifications at the back. And the Grand Vader, who had just displayed his invincible might and used a spell to forcefully shift the impact point of the Leviathan derivative, was nowhere to be seen at this moment. "He's most likely seizing the time to recover," Keyes secretly guessed. After all, casting such a spell in an instant just now consumed a lot of mental and physical strength. Judging others by one's own standards would most likely be biased. But when there were other facts to support it, the accuracy of this guess was actually not bad. And there were facts such as needing to use the lives of his subordinates to resist the half-demon monsters, allowing himself to leave at will, and so on. This made Keyes even more certain of his conjecture. He concluded that the Grand Vader was experiencing a short period of weakness. "I have to admit that your secret has indeed piqued my interest, but..." The young blue dragon's face revealed a playful expression. "Actually, there isn't much time left for you to make your statement. At most, we can wait for the Grand Vader to appear again. I won't risk making several powerful enemies for your possible groundless accusations. Staring into Lilith's eyes, Keyes knew that Lilith was still planning something. Have we reached a consensus? The palm that gripped Lilith's shoulder blade was once again surrounded by electric light. The smell of burnt flesh instantly rose. You have to know that time is life. In order to survive, Lilith, whose eyes had already turned white from the electric shock, nodded vigorously. Seeing that his face was still twitching, Keyes even kindly added a healing spell for him. Your Excellency Pasha, have you heard of magic addiction? Keyes shook his head. Lilith knew that his chance to survive had come, so he explained. You are also a spellcaster, so you must more or less have some understanding of the casting methods of the Ashes World's mages. You should know that ordinary human mages need to consume obsidian magic beads to cast spells. But you are not human after all. You don't know that anyone who has been a black-robe mage for more than 10 years will be infected with an incurable disease because of long-term immersion in spells. We have to consume obsidian magic beads regularly every day to relieve the symptoms of both physical and psychological addiction. Chapter 272. Pharaoh has an ore vein suitable for making obsidian magic beads, and only he has the right to mine it. The Grand Vader holds the secret of how to instill magic into the magic beads, and Kanini of the Obsidian Council can influence the allocation of magic beads to a certain extent. Since Keyes let go of his shoulder, Lilith was able to take out an obsidian magic bead from his robe. The shining magic bead was rubbed in his hand, and with the magic absorption, the power of the magic bead gushed out and healed the wounds on his body as well as his mental exhaustion. When the power contained in the magic bead was exhausted, it turned into a pile of broken stone fragments. This method of casting is indeed very convenient. He took a deep breath, and his words became clearer. But at the same time, it is also addictive. Even a most strong-willed spellcaster has no way to avoid it. Except for the Grand Vader and Kanini, I have to remind you that the two different casting methods of the Ash World mages are not a great secret to me. Interrupting Lilith's words, the young blue dragon warned bluntly, You better return to the original topic. Lilith's expression changed several times in an instant. He didn't expect that the Megalosaurus Pasha in front of him would know so many secrets. Although he had begun to hesitate, wondering if he should tell him what he knew, he felt that the thread in his words didn't seem fake, so he had no choice but to cooperate. Like a hollowed-out dough bag, Lilith's face became pale and lifeless. Indeed, as wise as you are, he flattered. He wanted to delay for a moment, but he found that Keyes' eyes revealed a trace of killing intent. That Kanini most likely has something to do with the demons of the lower realm, and there's always a stench similar to the smell of sulfur around him. But the Grand Vader, or the previous generations of Allans, were all born and raised in Medi. Logically speaking, they should use a similar method to us, using the life force of other creatures stored in the obsidian magic beads to cast spells. But that's not the case. Every Grand Vader is incomparably powerful, amazingly powerful. Lilith paused for a moment, and in order to gain Keyes' trust, he continued to add, I used to be very obsessed with this and wanted to explore the secrets. Through secretly collecting various ancient books, I learned that they are actually a school of mages passed down from ancient times, soul-binding mages, and they are the only inheritors today. After signing a contract with the first pharaoh, Medi's legendary hero, Ascender, they obtained the power to use the soul power of the dead Medi to cast spells. That is to say, soul. This was an authority that only the gods and ancient legends were qualified to wield. At the same time, this also explains why the previous generations of Vader were so powerful. Although they weren't gods, they weren't that far. Of course, the signing of the contract, and Allan's, Essen to the Vader. Every generation of Allan had to be loyal to the descendants of Ascender. They had to fulfill the promise of protecting Medic in order to continue to be strong. In this way, the Grand Vader should have no interest in worldly wealth. But in the past 100 years, the current generation of Allens has been secretly collecting gold. Because of his crazy hoarding, it even led to the disappearance of the gold currency in the Ash world. Because Lilith kept saying that he already knew the information, the young blue dragon had begun to become impatient. But his last sentence made Keys instantly alert. No wonder Mehdi had copper debentures and silver catars, but there was no currency made of gold. It turned out that in the past 100 years, the Grand Vader had been wantonly collecting gold. One had to know, gold was a natural currency. Even in Mountain Paradise, or the 9 prisons of Bader, as long as the plane itself was inclined toward order, gold also had a certain purchasing power and could be used as currency. To be fair, this did solve a question that had troubled Keys for a long time. Just based on the information revealed by Lilith, the young blue dragon decided that he had to be more lenient. He could leave the black-robed mage's body intact, and he could even consider letting the half-lich Sneyd do it himself and make a better mummy for him. After waking him up, he could be considered to have spared his life. Lilith, who had been carefully judging the emotional fluctuations of the Megalosaurus Pasha, saw the other party show a look of determination and immediately realized that his life was in danger. The Grand Vader must be planning something, but now he has built a museum and begun to revive extinct ancient creatures. Does he want to rely on the exhibition to collect admission fees? Lord Pasha, have you never thought about why this is? The hypnosis spell was suddenly activated, and Lilith, who wanted to continue speaking, was instantly affected. After he fell into a deep sleep, Keys picked him up with one hand, and then he was teleported to the anti-magic prison at the headquarters of the Scale of Perpetual Order in Gnome City. After a moment of silence, a shocking roar came from the museum in the lagoon. The young blue dragon sensed it. He had long noticed that the Grand Vader had recovered from his weakened state. The Lion of Naroya, who was wearing spiked armor, leaped out of the glass pyramid after its master removed the restrictions. Following closely behind, many velociraptors rushed out. Under the stimulation of the smell of blood in the air, the ferocity of these ancient beasts was aroused. They tapped their feet lightly and swept across the sandbars, pouncing on the half-demon camp that was fighting with the Day Watchman. These little guys are indeed not just for show. Looking down at the battlefield that had become even bloodier because of the addition of fresh troops, Keys couldn't help but be moved. Let's cooperate for once. After all, we do need a helper when facing a demon lord. Just now, Lilith's words had indeed awakened the young blue dragon. The Grand Vader had been collecting gold for more than 100 years, causing the gold standard currency system in the entire Ashes plane to no longer exist. At present, the only thing that could provide more gold in this world was the Scale of Perpetual Order, which operated interdimensional businesses that were unknown to outsiders. However, that person had not specifically asked for gold from him. This obviously didn't make sense, unless the Grand Vader was avoiding it. He didn't want Keys to have any understanding of his actions or even have any guesses. There were probably only 3 kinds of things in the world that couldn't be mentioned to others. The first was that it was of great benefit to oneself. The second was that it was harmful to others. And the third was a combination of the first and the second. Although there were priorities, and the priority should be to deal with the demons together, the matter that the Grand Vader was preparing for had a lot to do with him. It was difficult for Keys not to have scruples about it. It's almost dawn. I don't have much time left. Chapter 273. You dirty monster! The elite warrior of the day, Watchman, roared angrily. His left arm had gone limp due to the sneak attack, as if it had lost all its strength. Lying on top of him, the half-demon monster, whose gender couldn't be determined, let out a thirsty roar, but this roar quickly turned into a choked whimper. The skilled warrior used his still powerful right hand to bypass its defenses, bent his fingers into a powerful posture, and stabbed its thick and short throat. The half-demon monster retreated. As it wasn't a purebred Tana-wreathed demon, it also needed to breathe. Seizing the opportunity, the Day Watchman stepped forward, blocked the sharp claws, and used a shoulder strike to push the monster down the rocky ridge on the edge of the sandbar. The opportunist, who had been waiting for this opportunity, revealed a fatal smile. A group of 8-legged crocodiles pounced over, biting the half-demon monster with all their might, and then they began a dance of death. Of course, victory on the battlefield didn't mean anything. In this cruel and tragic battle, the monsters hatched from the floating behemoths were much more resilient than any enemy the Day Watchmen had ever encountered. After all, they were born to fight. In the acid fog canyon plain, they had absorbed the characteristics of many demons. Then, by absorbing the vitality of the flesh and blood of the Leviathan spawn, they had transformed in an extremely short period of time. The characteristics of the other Tana Reed demons were also manifested. For example, among this group of half-demon monsters, some of them waved their serrated arms, and their every move resembled a large praying mantis. The physiological characteristics they had inherited from the Babu demons caused their bodies to be wrapped in a layer of jelly-like red viscous liquid. Unless they were enchanted with protective spells, any weapon that attacked them would be corroded, and there was a certain chance that it would break into pieces on the spot. Coupled with their love of sneaking and ambushing, as well as their inhuman patience in order to launch dangerous backstabbing attacks, they had become one of the enemies that all the elite warriors of the Day Watchmen were most unwilling to face. Some half-demon monsters were even more dangerous, and their appearances were also very deceiving. For example, they had inherited the ancestral demon Bray, a type of demon created by the monarch of beasts, Buffett. However, due to their undisciplined nature and barbaric nature, they were unable to form a large-scale organization. In the end, they were released into the abyss by their creator. The half-demon monster that had obtained some of ancestral fiend Bray's characteristics had inherited the appearance of its original host. Their bodies were covered in festering abscesses, and their tall, thin skeletons were decorated with patches of short mane. They had huge, pale ram heads with curved horns, cold eyes, and lips with sticky saliva and needle-like teeth protruding from them. Their snake-like tails wriggled, ending in a tangle of metal spikes. Despite its thin body, it wielded its pitchforks, which were too large for its size, with an unnerving grace. Although they looked sickly, as if they were sick, in fact, their appearance was a kind of disguise. The purpose was to hide the powerful strength and ferocious nature under their seemingly weak bodies. Unlike the original host of the Bray ancestral demon, who was known as the Abyss Heavy Infantry, the half-demon monsters that were mutated from the acid mistworms and did not use too many spell-like abilities. Even so, they were used to starting the battle with a deafening roar before lowering their heads and doing all they could to charge into the enemy's formation and try to attack from a corner. If they were injured by the Day Watchmen at this time, these monsters would quickly fall into a state of blood rage. Their physique and strength would increase greatly at the same time, and the pitchforks they wielded would become more lethal. There were a variety of dangerous half-demon monsters, which made Keys, who had been overlooking the battlefield from high up in the sky, have an illusion. It was like a low-intensity, bloody battlefield. However, although the Day Watchmen who were fighting the demons were brave and good at fighting, they could not be compared to the war machines of the 9 prisons of Bader. Therefore, it didn't take long for them to be unable to withstand the pressure of casualties and began to gradually retreat to the rear. Fortunately, after a moment of delay, the fire dwarf craftsmen of the pickaxe unit had quickly set up a line of defense. Since the enemy did not, or at least did not show any proficiency in using Tana Ree's advanced teleportation ability, this line of defense set up at the throat of the lagoon should be able to play a certain role. With the help of magic, the highly efficient fire dwarf craftsmen not only dug a trench that was about 2 parecen in length in less than half an hourglass, they also mixed the dug soil with salt and silver powder to build a field wall that was slightly taller than most of the half-demon monsters. In front of this short wall, there were thousands of traps, including the simplest wooden stakes and spikes. Coupled with the ingenious height of the wall, it was definitely able to effectively stop the charge of the half-demon monsters. Moreover, The meticulous fire dwarf craftsman, in order to guard against monsters with stealth abilities, scattered stone debris and rocks around the short wall. As long as they were not careful, the enemy's stealth would be exposed. The day watchmen, who were fighting and retreating, began to retreat behind the wall of fire dwarfs in an orderly manner under the command of the day watchman sect general. They would regroup here and, together with the fire dwarf warriors, resist the attack of the half-demon monsters. The great craftsmen of the inner elemental plane, who exuded high heat and had copper skin and iron bones, were equally deadly when they waved the pickaxes in their hands. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that the sandbar at the mouth of the lagoon was too small and that they would fall into the sea with a slight movement, they would have long been unable to resist their belligerent nature and launched a counterattack against the half-demons. Gale Combo. Being besieged by several half-demon monsters that resembled Bray, the day watchman sect general, who stayed behind to cover the retreat, was not alarmed. Instead, he was overjoyed. The few sheep-headed monsters that surrounded him had invisibly blocked the half-demon in the form of a mantis that might have snuck over and was ready to launch a sneak attack at any time. This also allowed him to be unbridled and use his best skills without any fear. The rapid combo that was like a storm, coupled with the penetrating force that could easily split open stones, and the pair of unique weapons called Vajra palms in his hands, broke the bones of the sheep-headed half-demons around him in an instant. Even though they were in the enhanced state of blood rage, due to the damage to their joints, they couldn't even stand normally. They can't even withstand a single blow. Chapter 274. The magic sword that shone with a red light attacked and slashed at the duty general's body. Although he lowered his head at the last moment, the heavy sword still hit the side of his head. If it were any other warrior, this attack might not be a threat to the duty general who practiced martial arts, but OBEO, who was wearing a worm plate armor, was not. Hiss! The sharp pain in his shoulder made the duty general suck in a breath of cold air. The chain armor under his white robe made creaking sounds. The protective spell attached to it saved the wearer's life, but the aftermath of the magic sword was not so easy to deal with. The twisted chain buckle was constantly cracking. If the same position was hit again, this priceless treasure would be completely destroyed. You said can't even withstand a single blow. Aboard, the leader of the desert elf mercenaries, who was deeply affected by the worm plate armor, mocked in a low and hoarse voice. Judging from the current situation, I'm afraid you're describing yourself. In the face of ridicule, the duty general chose to fight back with practical actions. The crystal-like Vajra palm in his hand suddenly burst out with a dazzling light. His whole body was like a bolt of lightning in the shape of a snake, attacking his opponent from a strange angle. The magic sword and the Vajra palm collided and made a crisp, clang sound. The two of them were in a stalemate. The Sentinel General could clearly see the drooping eyelids on the eyes of the desert elf mercenary commander in an unnatural state. OBO was pushed back a few steps, but he was able to adjust the hilt of his sword to block the duty general's fist that came from below. He adjusted so quickly that the duty general almost lost the opportunity to defend himself. His face was almost cut by the downward pressure of the sword. Take this guy, you. It was the same strategy as the duty generals. The desert elf appeared to be blocking the attack, but the plate armor in front of its chest was wriggling. Accompanied by a sonic boom, a strange worm with spikes and scales, as thick as a bowl, shot out of it. Sea-splitting slash, Gale 36 consecutive strikes. At this critical moment, the duty general, who was nearly 60 years old, instantly exploded. His strong body, which was built up with the alchemy potions personally prepared by the great dimensional wizard, burst out with astonishing power. It was as if a storm had split open the surface of the sea. In the blink of an eye, a total of 36 attacks had been launched, be it slicing, pushing, or hammering. Not one more, not one less. Not only did he use the force to increase the distance between himself and OBO, but he also killed the strange worm at the same time. Clenching his hands, the duty general eased the soreness and swelling of his arms caused by the quick palm attack. He stared at his opponent with bright eyes, no longer underestimating him. On the other hand, his opponent, due to the continuous heavy blows like a storm, the worm-plate armor on the desert elf's body had a crack. Moreover, because the duty general's attack contained a special penetrating force, there was blood at the corner of Obio's mouth. Although he was heavily injured, he did not have the slightest bit. He stretched out his arm, and the magic sword in his hand suddenly turned into a magic whip. The desert elf waved it from afar, rolling up a half-demon monster and dragging it to his feet. Poof! From below the iron gauntlet, Obio's 2 forearms instantly turned into 2 acid worms and burrowed into the half-demon monster's body. Then, with a disgusting gurgling sound, the unlucky monster shriveled up at a speed visible to the naked eye, like a swimming pool with its valve opened. After absorbing a large amount of half-demon flesh, not only was the worm-plate armor repaired, but Obio's face also showed a strange, cruel, and satisfied expression. Delicious. The desert elf, whose mind had been completely distorted by the demon lord's creation, licked his lips as if he was stating a fact. He looked at the Sun Duty General and cracked his mouth into a wanton smile. Your flesh and blood. Maybe it tastes good too. Just as the monster leader was about to pounce on its opponent again, a Star's Fury cannonball, an obsidian ball that was filled with magic power and covered with 2-inch-long spikes, accurately hit Obio's cheek and exploded. Not far from the two, Commander Wenfeng, who was wearing a blue robe, held a weapon similar to a small crossbow in his hand. He was struggling to open the bullet slot and insert a second Star's Fury shell. The explosion hurt the desert elf, but it did not take his life. In fact, this demon servant, whose face was full of obsidian fragments, had just absorbed some of the characteristics of Ancestor Demon Bray, and because of his injury, the Blood's Fury bonus was triggered. You bastards! The Fire Dwarf clan chief threw the enchanted pickaxe called Magus's Tooth in a spinning motion. It drew a half-arc in the air and wedged into Obio's armpit. Even with the protection of the worm-plate armor, this vicious blow still hurt him badly. Die! He opened his arms, and tens of thousands of acid mist worms suddenly shot out. Everything within a radius of 100 steps was instantly riddled with holes. Some of the half-demon monsters that surrounded him also suffered. The worm tentacles, which did not distinguish between friend and foe, pierced their bodies and brought them back to feed the injured demon servants. I think this guy is not easy to deal with. Holding the Magus's tooth that automatically teleported back to his hand after hitting the target, the Fire Dwarf clan chief used his shoulder to press against a tower shield called Iron Wall. He frowned and said to Commander Wenfeng behind him, "You better have a plan." His Excellency the Great Vader still needs to wait for a while. Commander Wenfeng, who did not care about his image, listened to the sound of the wind. Through the shield, he stretched his neck and shouted at the Sunwatch Sect general who had fled far away to avoid the attack. "Old man, delay him for a while longer. The counterattack force is already here." Although the situation was a little difficult for a while, and they had already fallen to the situation where communication basically relied on shouting, the cunning Commander Wenfeng still had a clear mind. His words still contained traps and traps. They were indeed prepared for the counterattack, but distant water could not quench the immediate thirst. Moreover, even the organized Sunwatch sect and the Fire Dwarf Pickaxe Troop could not withstand 2 more thousands of piercing to end everything from the Desert Elf. But he still had to say it. His purpose was to numb Obio so that when Obio was distracted, Commander Wenfeng could use his trump card to attack. The crossbow that was loaded with shells aimed at the target, and the Star's Fury was fired again. Obio, who was on guard, felt the fire coming from behind the shield. Magic power instantly gushed out from the worm-plate armor and set up a pale red light curtain in front of him. But the explosion that he imagined did not happen. The Star's Fury hit the light curtain and only produced some pale yellow smoke. Chapter 275. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? Pale yellow smoke spread out, and several mummies wrapped in shrouds revealed themselves. They hesitated for a moment, and then a reply rang out in their minds. Kill him. Get rid of that demon's servant, and you will obtain eternal peace. Hearing Commander Wenfeng's promise, the mummies who were treated as trump cards were no longer confused. These high-grade undead creatures that were personally made by the Grand Vexer using the black-robed mage's path of sin as raw materials suddenly felt the meaning of their existence. Okay, I understand. Yes, Your Majesty. After replying in their souls, they began the last task of their long lives, to personally destroy OBO, who was wearing the worm plate armor. Regardless of whether he resisted or not, they would not stop until he was dead. The process of being mummified by the Grand Vexer was definitely the most painful punishment. None of the black-robed mages who had committed serious crimes were easy to deal with. Therefore, their bodies would be sealed, and they would be forced to go through a horrifying journey of replacing their internal organs with herbs and alchemy potions until they reached the shore of death. Everything was fated, and everything was lost. There would be gains. After being mummified and experiencing an incomparably painful death, not only would they obtain the brand-new power of high-grade undead creatures, but they would also retain the abilities they had when they were alive. As for their enemy, the desert elf OBO, although he had only interacted with him for a short while, he already had a deep understanding of this. Even with the wormplate armor he was wearing, part of OBO's body had turned into acid mist worms, allowing him to successfully avoid the effects of the terrifying glare and the blinding powder, but the vicious rotten corpse disease still found him. While he was busy mobilizing his power to suppress the symptoms of the disease in his body, the desert elf also had to be on guard against the decaying fist of a few mummies that surrounded him. Unexpectedly, these mummies, who looked like spellcasters when they were alive, had become extraordinarily strong after they died. Not only were their heavy punches strong and powerful, they also carried a terrible decaying curse. Using all his strength, Aubert dodged these mummies that had turned into close combat enthusiasts after death, but the yellow sand that filled the sky followed him like a shadow. If he was not careful, he would be caught. However, it was fortunate that these mummies were not proficient in their joint attack techniques. When one of them found an opportunity to get close to the desert elf and wanted to split open OBO's skull with his axe like a ripe watermelon, his companions were still casting indiscriminate AoE spells. Bang! Due to the interference of the sand and dust, the axe struck Aubert's raised iron gauntlet, producing sparks. Anticipating that the other party might change his tactics, the mercenary leader hurriedly dodged to the side and stabbed the magic sword that he had just formed into his opponent's chest. Under the guidance of his instincts and skillful skills, Aubert used the spikes on his iron gauntlet to hook and pull and disarm the other party's weapon. Without any mercy, Aubert had never been stingy with the most barbaric and dark means in battle. With the addition of the strength of the worm plate armor, Aubert's heavy fist was like a battering ram as it hit the hilt of the magic sword and nailed it into the mummy's heart. A violent explosion suddenly occurred. The saltpeter, sulfur, and carbon powder mixed in the magic sword were ignited and exploded due to the impact. The mummy that was nailed into its chest was torn apart, and some of its broken body parts were instantly destroyed. Bah! Spitting out the sand in his mouth, Aubert's legs seemed to be equipped with springs as he stomped heavily on the ground twice. Then, he quickly leaped into the midst of the group of half-demons. It's enough to contain these undead creatures. The main goal is to break through that line of defense. Pointing at the short wall that the fire dwarf craftsman had just built not long ago, Aubert said in a deep voice, Master's target should still be in the museum behind. To be honest, the desert elf's performance was still considered calm. He was not blinded by the sudden power that he had. However, according to the way he commanded the mercenaries, how could he expect the chaotic creatures like the Thanner Reed demons to obey him? Just like in their home, these half-demons formed by the acid mistworms were still used to the fighting style of the Thanner Reed demons. To them, charging like a swarm of bees had already become an instinct. Therefore, not long after Aubert gave the order, he frowned. As a veteran mercenary leader, The desert elf could swear on his own experience that he had never experienced such a chaotic battlefield. It was like a pot of soup with carelessly added side dishes and stewed meat. His order was like adding a handful of firewood to the bottom of the cauldron. The entire battlefield was boiling. There was no reserve team, no tactics. The half-demons only relied on their high attack and high HP to rush forward. Other than the savage nature that was stimulated by blood and slaughter, there was almost no redeeming quality. Originally, the desert elf only intended to send a small number of troops to contain a few mummies. He only wanted to buy some time to break through the line of defense on the front of the battlefield and to eliminate the general on duty, the Fire Dwarf Chief, and Commander Winfong. But when it came to the execution stage, containment became a siege without any warning. And because a few mummy spellcasters were difficult to deal with, a large number of half-demons became the pinned down instead. Seeing this situation, the defenders hiding behind the low walls even had the opportunity to pick up their crossbows and launch a long-range attack from the side. Even though most of the half-demons were not too afraid of the crossbow bolts, they could not withstand the presence of sharpshooters among them. The sharpshooters shot arrows into the weak points of their body defense and eliminated them at a fixed point. Push out Triumph and Fury. Taking advantage of the chaos on the battlefield, Commander Winfong had quietly retreated behind the trenches. Since he did not have to worry about the undead being injured, he decisively ordered the soldiers to prepare the stone cannons. Aimed at the battlefield in front. Well, just fire. Several small, high-efficiency trebuchets built by the Fire Dwarf craftsmen were assembled. After they were fixed in place, the 6 spiral arms began to spin rapidly with the whooshing sound of arrows passing through the air. Stones the size of millstones, black oil barrels mixed with pine resin and sawdust. All the cannonballs that could be found and estimated to be able to cause damage to the monsters were all carried out by the Fire Dwarves and loaded into the launching net. Under the effect of centrifugal force, the cannonballs shot out, drawing a half-arc trajectory in the sky and falling into the chaotic formation of the half-demons that were squeezed into a pot of porridge. At the right time, the sharpshooters also ignited their fire arrows and chased after the cannonballs that were loaded with highly adhesive combustibles, adding fuel to the fire for the cold half-demons. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.